Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Josh and I are going to do a quick tag team on this presentation. I just wanted to let you know that it's actually 30 years ago since the actual first conference in Perth on water-sensitive urban design. I've actually got the proceedings down there, and if anyone wants to have a look. So this has been a journey that's been going on for a long time, and the early work was very much about conceptualisation and advocacy, and I guess what we're really keen on now is this notion of scaling up. How do we actually make things really happen? The presentation is really about that notion of scaling up. How do we get those questions asked in the system to really make it mainstreaming? What does real learning mean, and what is the additional learning that needs to happen to make it get locked in to the institutional systems? So we're going to talk about a series of Perth case studies or demonstration projects that are real, and a lot of the learning can come out, and then frame the question about how do we actually lock that into the journey moving forward, and what are the next steps we need to tackle. The whole scaling up question and mainstreaming is how do we really facilitate system learning and lock it into the institutional arrangements and the ways that we do business. And I guess with my 30 years journey, and I was reflecting on the talk yesterday that Chris Chesterfield gave around that integrated approaches to getting the land and water integration, and for me it still boils down to making sure that the planning system asks the right questions at the right time, from the lot level up to the subdivision level, to really make these things happen. But another really key question that this journey continues to evolve around is how do we really get industry more involved? And I've said many times over the last little while that the amount of investment that we put from a research point of view into this, around $500,000 to $1 million a year, is insignificant in the context of the amount of capital that is spent every year in terms of urban development. If you just go through the quick math of multiplying what it costs to buy a new home versus that in a good year there's 25-odd thousand, we're basically investing somewhere between one lot and maybe 3 lots of expenditure on trying to actually shift a system which is billions of dollars worth of investment. So how do we actually get that to shift? How do we really gain the insights around where the blockages are to actually move the system forward? And this little diagram comes out of a conversation with Greg Cash, who's a board member of the CRC. He took over from my role on the board a couple of years ago when I was shifting roles. And his insight was, I think, fundamental to the way we need to think about all the demonstration projects we put in place. There's value at the project level for doing the innovation, but there's also critical value to the partners for every project. And most importantly, there's value to the system out of those projects. The question becomes, often the project is prepared to invest, maybe the partners are prepared to invest, but there's not always a lot of investment in that learning process at the system level, and that's what we've got to get better at. So I'm going to hand over to Josh now, and he's going to talk you through this trajectory of project that he's been deeply involved in, and as part of the Curtin process we've been helping that journey get documented and learnt, if you like. So Josh, please.
Thanks, Mike. As Mike mentioned, my task for you this morning is to give you a quick tour of these 4 case study projects, but within the context of how we've set about with a planned approach to test ideas, to share the learnings, to collaborate and build in scale. What's, I guess, unique about this suite of projects is that each of them tackles the notion of urban sustainability in metropolitan areas in an integrated way. So we don't just look at water, we look at energy, we look at good urban design, and of course we look at livability. And it's how these considerations are really approached together that makes these projects exemplars beyond just water, but really exemplars in urban development at different scales. And just quickly, all this work is about collaboration. I've been very fortunate to be part of a design team behind these projects, but we have partnered with the likes of Development WA, of course, through 3 of these projects, with the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, and of course Water Corporation in all of them. And just one quick note, so much so that we've even borrowed this idea of the trajectory, it was Adele Gismondi from Watercorp who first came up with presenting our projects in this way. Internally, as kind of a collaboration and project team, we had a very clear understanding how each thing we were testing from project to project and how that flowed. But when communicating them, Adele said, you know what we've got here is Baby Bear, which is Josh's house. We've got Mama Bear, which is WGV, and we have Papa Bear, which is 115 Hamilton Hill. But we've of course got the weird uncle to one side, which is East Village. But I'll explain how these all fit together as we go through. Goldilocks, thank you. So we'll start with Josh's house, my family home. It's a very simple 2-lot subdivision in the suburb of Hilton. A fairly conventional battle axe subdivision, which is the standard for this type of inner urban green, garden suburb that's undergoing subdivision, and in many cases we saw in the keynote to very, very poor outcomes. So this project was about how do we work in with a conventional planning framework using volume builders, conventional design techniques and construction methods to deliver high performance homes that are more compact, both net energy producers, they produce more energy than they use, they're 10-star NetHES homes, comfortable year round, they have a suite of integrated water sensitive design considerations, and very importantly, as a keen gardener, a thriving productive cooling landscape. It's the small scale model that the average person can relate to. And I guess the key thing for this project, our audience really was the wider public. Each of the projects I'm showing has been underpinned not only by good design and a research program, as Michael alluded to, but also a communications plan. So here we really reached out to the popular audience through national television, through videos, through open days that would attract thousands of people, and of course exciting the market and showing leadership in this space. So the idea was to do something that looked like anything else up and down the street and aligned with the Waterwise messaging of the day through DWER and Watercorp. So Waterwise landscaping, shady and cool, providing habitat, advanced hydrozoning, so the water's put around the house where it's cooling and shady and looks beautiful, and complements climate sensitive responsive design. And the technical focus was really on understanding the opportunities and limitations of lot scale non-drinking water sources like rainwater, greywater reuse and a shared bore between the two properties, but really underpinned by a very detailed water balance that identified where the best use of these water sources were, and when put together through good design, where the water savings could really take us to. And we saw a 90% reduction in mains water saving. There's very detailed performance monitoring at the home, now 7 years and running, across a whole range of parameters, including water use, energy for the watering systems and the like. So that's the long-term legacy, but the results speak for themselves when done well. But of course, we need to scale up. You know, we're not all as enthusiastic as perhaps I am in running these systems. How do we start to look at opportunities to deploy at scale? And the next opportunity that came up was at WGV Biodevelopment WA. You all know this project by now. It's been a case study supported by the CRC for water sensitive cities. Very importantly, it's a gold Waterwise development through the Watercorp's Waterwise development program, and again a great partnership project with a number of people involved. So the things to test here were, how do we start to embed not only water efficiency but broader water sensitive outcomes at a precinct scale? How do we deploy the right types of technology within different building technologies? So green title individual lots that are more compact, group housing, and of course multi-residential as well. And again, within the context of a net zero energy development. It's not just about water, it's about addressing carbon as well. So in addition to testing things like design guidelines and ways of engaging the right developers for the larger sites, all of which have yielded some very useful learnings, we could also start to look at precinct scale infrastructure, where the smaller lots just don't justify lot scale approaches. And so we have the community bore, and whilst the technology is pretty straightforward, it's really about the governance mechanism here, with the partnership with City of Fremantle, who agreed from the planning stage to take ownership over the scheme and manage it in such a way where it can be optimised. And of course what that does is start to put into place a process where other sources of water can be used to supply irrigation. we're also able to then look at the opportunities that come through land value uplift to rejuvenate the public realm. So as the private space gets smaller with tighter lots, how do we start to look at doing things like rejuvenating stormwater assets like the local sump, which was a partnership between Development WA and City of Fremantle for public space. So what was closely fenced off and weedy is now a thriving pocket park. And again, detailed monitoring throughout, looking at where the water savings are and where things can be improved. On to East Village. This is a project that is under construction at the moment. All of the civil works and public realm landscaping is done. This is a 1.5 hectare development again by Development WA. There's a theme here, just a short walk out of the CBD of Fremantle on former industrial land. And it consists of 36 townhomes and 2 apartment sites. There's a virtual tour that we did with the CRC for water sensitive cities, so you can check that out for more detail. But really the focus here is how do you deliver the same types of aspirations but using a survey strata model. So the main difference is about the land titling and the opportunities that provides around having greater control on infrastructure, servicing and maintenance, overcoming some of the challenges we saw when done through a more conventional green title approach at WGV. And one of the advantages with the survey strata is you can have shared surfaces. So in addition to the precinct scale battery of 670 kilowatt hours, the strata bore servicing both private and public green space, there's also an embedded metering system that will provide advanced metering and analytics to energy and water use, not only for billing purposes and feedback to households, but also to really enable us to interrogate seriously the performance of this system over time. Then finally, the last case study, this is Papa Bear. This is 115 Hamilton Hill by Development WA. This is a 12 hectare development site on the former Hamilton Senior High School in the city of Coburn. It's an amazing site. And the focus here is really how do we normalise this stuff, okay? So we've tested it in those previous case studies, and I would like to think that the very best of all of those projects is being deployed here. So all up there's going to be around 300 dwellings across 220 odd lots over 3 stages of development. So multi-typology, ranging densities to suit that particular location, big focus on high quality public realm, targeting a future urban forest canopy of 30%, and of course bringing in things both lot scale and precincts or development scale infrastructure. Just to finish off then, without going into more detail about the technical benefits of the project, really the focus here for all concerned is about knowledge transfer around process. We've been fortunate in these earlier projects and this one to get a lot of things up that other consultants complain that they can't. And what we wanted to do here was to, from the very beginning, from the planning stage, bring key stakeholders in, DWER, Water Corp, Development WA of course, City of Coburn, in a shared knowledge sharing program that looks at really answering this question about how do we mainstream water sensitive practice in Perth's development industry, because what we keep hearing is that it's hard to get the stuff over the line. So the main outcome of this ongoing project that will track through the development planning and approvals, which is now done, we're now into construction phase. The next phase will document that, and then finally the occupation and maintenance phase is to look at what things can help get the types of aspirational water sensitive city practices over the line, running alongside the standard development industry rollout process, which is that column on the left. In the middle is the better urban water management process, so what is already a very good and very clear process through local water management strategy, urban water management plan. How do we do additional activities in line with the types of aspirations of the Waterwise action plan for Perth, the types of activities that have been promoted through the CRC for water sensitive cities and now the water transition network in Perth. What are these activities? How do we join the dots? So it's beyond compliance, it's leading towards best practice for the front end to hopefully see this stuff eventually embedded in policy. So that first guide for the first phase is now published, and Mike will tell you where you get that at the end of the presentation. Back to Mike to wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. I think we're running a little bit over time, but I'll just a couple of quick slides. So all of this, I guess, is great, but often we get this notion of pushback because it's a project that's been led by a state agency, Development WA, and there's some key players like Josh and or Warren Phillips from Development WA that are leading it. There are always champions in the systems, and I guess the key thing that's come out of this has been this innovation sells, and that's a big message to go back to the development sector. I guess the real challenge moving forward is to get that wider innovation embedded and actually develop a suite of these sort of innovation projects that are actually led and managed and more integrated with the development sector as part of that process. You know, what are the learning questions that they need? And so the proposition is we just need to continue that learning journey. This little conceptualisation is, you know, a series of case studies that have got learning within themselves, but they're also linked as part of that system learning process that I talked about earlier. How do we lock in those learning and change the learning moving forward? And the other thing that seems to be very worthwhile is using, you know, the learning out of the whole research process of the transition dynamic framework to go, you know, if we're going to do more demonstrations, it's more than just the project, it's actually figuring out what are all the other elements of the system that need to be looked at and intervened with or, you know, progressed as we do those demonstrations. And so thank you for the opportunity to share those insights, and really what we wanted to make sure you're aware of is on Josh Byrne and Associates website at Resources, all of the learning that's come out of all of those processes is documented there. So that's there to share for everyone moving forward. So thank you very much. We're happy to take any questions. So Josh. There's one down. Ian, are you going to?
Yeah, so the cost is obviously something that is brought up, but what were the savings for the overall infrastructure that was needed to be put in, or was there a comparison between, okay, so it's going to cost, you know, X thousand to put in stormwater tanks or rainwater tanks at 7,000 litre ones versus the requirement?
Sure.
Versus the requirement for actually upgrading water connection systems and all that sort of stuff. Were there any savings that were?
Sure. So that's an enormously complicated question, and if I launch into it in detail, I'm bound to be thrown off the stage. But it's a very good question, and it's one that we're asked often. My shortest possible response is that each project has different business case considerations around it. If we reduce it down to just understanding the business case based on a comparative cost per kilolitre of scheme water, then we're going backwards very quickly. It's about looking at sort of system design, opportunities where through appropriate infrastructure choice and sizing, you might be able to defer some capital upgrades, particularly in infill sites. Then also it's about what is the product you've got to sell at the end of it, and where is the premium that comes from that. So in each of those case studies, there are different takes on those principles that I mentioned. I'll probably park it there to not take up much more time, but suffice to say that each of these projects have been commercially successful. So Development WA with WGV, East Village at Knutsford and 115 Hamilton Hill are required, even though they are part of the innovation through demonstration suite of projects, they're required to return a commercial outcome. And so rest assured, the business cases behind all the propositions are heavily scrutinised. But thankfully, they also take an approach where, you know what, it's about how does a whole project perform financially. And that includes cost savings to the project as well as how well they sell. So I believe there's a session this afternoon through the integrated case studies that's going to look at some of the outcomes for East Village, and of course happy to have a further chat offline from that.
So we'll have to just hold questions till afterwards. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Maybe we can return to questions.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So just to keep things on track, I'll discard the introductions, but other than to say the next speaker is Kate Bushby, who works as the Swan Canning Quality Improvement Plan Coordinator at the DBCA. And Kate is here to talk to us about or provide a summary of constructed wetland performance in the Perth region. Thanks, Kate.
Right, I'll get started anyway. As mentioned, I work for the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. So I work in a team within the Rivers and Estuaries branch, which aims to improve water quality before it hits the Swan and Canning rivers, but also now in the Swan and Canning rivers through the oxygenation plans. One of the other aims that we have is to try and create these demonstration sites for nutrient intervention and to evaluate those to contribute to the knowledge base about how they're performing in the WA context. So what I'm aiming to talk about today is to provide a brief overview of some of the performance assessments that were completed through the CRC, including the main findings from those, and then how we've applied those findings in the operation and maintenance of each site and the design of new sites. And then lastly, just to wrap up, where we hope to take the findings from here. So before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge some of our key partners in this work. One of those obviously being the CRC for enabling this work to happen. To the University of Western Australia, who undertook a lot of the research, and particularly to Carolyn, Matt, Carlos, Andrew, Tanvir, Anna and Hassan for also being able to translate those findings into language and take-home messages that we've been able to apply. To the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, who provide us with ongoing advice, but also collected a lot of the data that I'll present today, and for leading the biofilters project, which we will talk about as well. To Water Corporation, who are increasingly doing fantastic work in this space. And lastly, to Chem Centre for the chemical analysis, but also for co-funding the study at Eric Singleton. And I've missed the local governments. They're absolutely critical in the work that we do. And I particularly want to acknowledge some of the champions that we work with at Bayswater and Canning for sharing our vision for these sites and co-funding the construction works, the monitoring, and for undertaking the maintenance. So there's 4 main sites I'll talk about today, and I won't go into a lot of detail on them as some of you will be quite familiar with them already. But one of the sites is the Amberway Compensation Basin Living Stream, where, as you can see in the before and after pictures, a living stream was retrofitted into what was an existing comp basin. So the living stream operates in low flows, with the benched areas becoming active and flooded in large events to still maintain the conveyance capacity of the system. Wharf Street Wetland, which obviously featured in yesterday's site tours, located behind the City of Canning Council offices. And this project replaced some power lines, a road and an underutilised waterlogged area, and replaced that with this compartmental wetland system that includes 2 open water, surface water, wetland components and 2 subsurface flow components as well. The last wetland that I'll talk about is the Eric Singleton Bird Sanctuary wetland, which features in the City of Bayswater catchment. So as you can see in the picture in the top left, it was quite a degraded wetland which was artificially filled every year by the local government with bore water to manage the acid sulphate soils on site, but also to keep up with community expectations for an open water body. So around 2015, there was a diversion put into the Bayswater Brook to divert a portion of that water into this wetland through a treatment train which consists of a gross pollutant trap, and then into the wetland system, which now features a sedimentation pond, but also an elongated flow path, which was created by extending a limestone track out to an existing island within the wetland. And then I'll briefly talk about an urban stormwater BMPs project that Department of Water and Environmental Regulation really led, which assessed the performance of a bioretention basin, but also some rain gardens located within a median strip in the Glades development. And 2 really good outcomes from this project was the development of a guideline for monitoring in areas of high groundwater, and also a guide for planting biofilters in WA. So to undertake the performance assessments, we worked with the CRC and engaged the University of Western Australia who examined nutrient and heavy metal data that had been collected both from events and from routine monthly water quality sampling. They also examined, in the case of Anvil and Wharf Street, sediment and macrophyte data that had been collected for a number of years. Loggers were installed in some of these sites and proved critical for really understanding the whole picture of how they're performing. And then flow data had been collected at some sites, but UWA undertook some additional flow analysis to really be able to calculate the load data for these sites. And then using all of this information, a water and nutrient balance could be calculated, and UWA were able to draw some conclusions about how these systems are performing. So what did we learn? I think one of the findings I was most surprised at was how much the flow path can be compromised without being necessarily visually obvious. And two examples come to mind at Eric Singleton Bird Sanctuary in particular. So there's a gross pollutant trap located about 3 metres underground under about 1 metre of water. If you went to site, visually you could see the water flowing in and out of the system. The pipes are underwater, so it's difficult to gauge how much flow is coming out of these pipes, but you can see that they're flowing. A couple of times a year, the local government would organise for a suction truck to come to site, take the lid off the GPT, suck out the mucky water and some of the gross pollutants that were floating within the chamber, and everything looked reasonably okay. And then during the performance assessment, we were able to see that flows from the GPT were sometimes limited to about 5 litres a second, so down from the design values of about 50 litres a second. But what happened during the performance assessment was that the cleaning practices changed as well. So a different contractor was engaged, they used a completely different methodology, and the flow was sometimes up to 150 litres a second following those cleans. So we were able to capture some really good data on that, and there's some work that we hope to do in that space to continue that, which I'll talk about a bit later. Another key finding on this site in relation to the flow paths as well was a adjacent drain, so the Bayswater main drain or the Bayswater Brook, which feeds the wetland system. The level in there was elevated by about 30 to 50 centimetres due to a macrophyte and sediment build-up, which was reducing its conveyance capacity. But it wasn't until UWA collected the data that we were able to see what impact this was having on the wetland systems. So during a storm event, which we're very rarely on site for, about 60 to 80% of the water was in fact entering the wetland through the location it was supposed to be exiting from, causing the system to effectively operate in reverse for a small portion, and only a tiny bit of the treatment train was used before the water was discharged back into the brook. Some of the other learnings that we got, I guess, was really the how critical it is to understand the water balance on site. So often side drains and groundwater can be a really big contributor to these systems, and through our studies seem to consistently be around 70% of the input, which is really easy to miss in a just one-off grab sampling at the inlet and the outlet. These side drains, whilst they can be a source of dilution within the wetland, more often than not they're a source of contaminants, and they're undervaluing how well these systems are performing if they're not accounted for. As we'll talk about a few times today, and has already been touched on in some of the presentations, but loggers proved absolutely critical for our understanding of how these systems are working, and a good example of that I think is in relation to dissolved oxygen monitoring. So, often we'd go to site between about 10 and 3 on a nice day, throw the probe in, the oxygen levels would look okay, we weren't too concerned. And it wasn't until these performance assessments and we got the data back that really we could start to understand what happens when there isn't sunlight on site, and there is sometimes a release of nutrients because of low dissolved oxygen conditions. I think one of the other great findings we got in relation to flow was really about how well some of those biofilters are performing at reducing peak flows, so up to about 89% reduction in flows, which has the associated benefits of preventing erosion and maintenance downstream. We also saw that the infiltration rates within these systems are heavily impacted by the groundwater levels, so as the groundwater rises, the infiltration rate decreases, which will become an increasingly important consideration in WA as we move to develop more and more in areas with high groundwater. In terms of nutrient performance, so the assessments really showed that these systems are performing really well in terms of their nutrient removal. So we were often seeing reduction in heavy metals of about 50% and reduction in nutrients of at least 40 to 60%. Residence time was shown to be really critical, and at some sites in high flow events like at Amber Way, for example, the residence time was on occasions less than an hour, so there wasn't much opportunity for nutrient removal. As we've already mentioned, dissolved oxygen concentrations were really critical for understanding the full picture about how the system's performing. The sediment monitoring really revealed that the sediments were really a significant store of nutrients within these systems. So I think about 2 tonnes of phosphorus at Amber Way and 16 tonnes of nitrogen are stored in the sediments alone. Another interesting finding I thought was we also assessed the difference between the below ground and the above ground biomass of different macrophytes, and the below ground biomass was really storing about 2 to 3 times more than the above ground biomass, with Baumia articulata identified as a particular standout species in terms of its the biomass it was storing. It's also got quite a favourable growth cycle in that it doesn't have large seasonal loss. And then, as shown in the Wharf Street video, that surface and subsurface flow components creating those different redox conditions are really important for the removal of different nutrient species. And I think these performance assessments are really good at showing the potential to use these and include public open space on top as well. So as we've talked about, a lack of effective maintenance, particularly weed and sediment removal, can really challenge these sites, and the performance assessments showed that it was really evident in the data. So for us, some cost data indicates that infrequent maintenance is much more expensive than regular maintenance, and at Amber Way, you know, up to 3 times greater. 3 minutes? Okay, I have to move pretty quick. So about 3 times greater to do infrequent maintenance than regular annual maintenance, and that's because the weed and sediment growth increases exponentially, really. So as the weeds grow, traps more sediment, et cetera, and then as they're not maintained, you can also get blowouts and erosion and things, loss of plants that you need to fix as well, adding to the maintenance cost. So I will fly through this. Keep going. All right, I got 12 minutes on my time. All right. So this is another example at Eric Singleton here, where that build-up's happened within a year within the drain. It's really accelerated in the last couple of months. And what we hope to be able to achieve here is determining with our partners and through further studies, like a critical level at basically what level that drain build-up starts to impact the wetland, and then have a proactive maintenance agreement where the partners agree that we can will go in at that point. So here's just a lesson learnt from an earlier project, and that's around the management of the sediments within these systems and allowing periodic drying, so ideally say once a year, and that's to prevent the build-up of those monosulfidic oozes. And this is an example from Lee Street wetland where it was pretty costly and logistically challenging to remove that sediment when they're not allowed to oxygenate. So how have we been applying these findings? So we've seen, I think, some really good proof of concepts, and we're increasingly confident in the ability to retrofit living streams in comp basins, to have wetlands that feature those surface and subsurface flow components, including with POS on top if that's desired, and that extending flow paths within existing wetlands were shown to be effective as well. So where we're taking that, I guess, is we've learnt the importance of loggers, as keeps coming up, and we've installed those in some of our other sites. They're also increasingly affordable and easy to use. We're undertaking some further performance assessments given the benefits of Anvil and Wharf, such as the one at Eric Singleton. As mentioned, the gross pollutant trap at Eric Singleton, looking to get some telemetered equipment installed in that to inform when the cleaning's done, instead of it just being part of a scheduled maintenance, or you know, getting done when people have time to organise for it to be. And then additional monitoring at some of these side drains to understand those other inputs and accurately determine the nutrient balance. So some of the operational activities, as mentioned, we're trying to dry out some of the sediments within these systems to increase their oxygen levels. Understanding the importance of sediments in nutrient removal, we're trying to prioritise their maintenance. Also undertaking additional weed maintenance to improve the dissolved oxygen and flow dynamics within the systems. Working to try and get these systems flowing as optimally designed. I think something that's a little bit controversial, I know people have different opinions on it, but that's about macrophyte harvesting. So our research, or the research that was done through UWA, really showed for us that the impact of the macrophytes in the above ground biomass is minimal compared to some of the other processes happening on site. So we haven't prioritised harvesting as a maintenance activity to date. And then I guess we're also learning that these systems are more robust than we thought. So we're getting increasingly confident in their flow paths and looking to simplify the flow paths where possible, but keep the controls in place. So in terms of some of the other key things, and I'll fly through these pretty quickly, but just understanding the water balance, building in monitoring opportunities, particularly in the early stages of design. So for example, in new sites where we can, we're putting in mag flow meters from the beginning. The importance of using loggers, and I just put the graph in at the bottom just to show, I guess, that a couple of grab samples at the wrong time. So basically any value, any of the red circles below 0 would represent a release from the system. So just important to try and get that whole picture where you can. So finally, in the design of new systems, just understanding that maintenance has been, access for maintenance is critical, understanding the retention time and being able to manipulate that is critical as well. Where we're doing extra planting, we have favoured Baumia articulata. The treatment train, we've since built another wetland with a subsurface and surface flow component, and looking at how to oxygenate these systems where possible. So in terms of where to from next, just to wrap up, so we'll be keeping an eye on a great CRC project that UWA and Water Corp are working on to understand when the in-stream vegetation, which is undoubtedly needed for nutrient management, becomes an issue for conveyance, and how does its removal reduce nutrient attenuation. Also, we've developed this site selection and prioritisation decision tool within DBCA. So it uses a spatial query to identify sites for potential nutrient management. But what we'll be able to do following these performance assessments is feed that knowledge into the decision support tool to help us rank particular sites and particular target nutrient species and assess their cost benefit. One of my favourite projects that's currently going on with the CRC and a range of partners is to remodel the nutrient loads from the Swan Canning coastal subcatchments and the Avon catchment in the same model at the same time period, and to couple those to a receiving water quality model developed for the Swan and Canning estuary. And we hope to be able to use this information to assess how effective the Swan Canning water quality improvement plan has been, to consider land use and climate change to 2050 in Perth and what that might look like and the impact of these, to look at some different nutrient capping scenarios. It'll help us to prioritise the 30 subcatchments in terms of which ones should have, there will be a focus, I should say, for nutrient management. And ideally, we'd like to use this response to help progress the development of new water quality targets for the Swan Canning, which is a hugely complex understanding, but we'd like to keep moving in that direction. So I was going to go into the modelling process a little bit here, but I'll skip over that and just sort of explain that I guess where the performance assessments fit is once this higher level modelling is done, a level down from that will be some scenario modelling, so starting to look at what interventions might be effective where. And when the original Swan Canning Water Quality Improvement Plan was developed, there was only 3 years of data from the Leigh Street wetland that was able to feed in, but through these performance assessments we now have a much better understanding of constructed wetlands, living streams and biofilters. So if anyone's interested in some more information, the full performance assessment reports are on the CRC website, or if you prefer, there's a 20 or so page summary on the DBCA website. And that was it from me.
Yeah, I think we've got time for one or two questions. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty excited that, you know, we've got 2 case studies which show that this stuff is technically and economically feasible, and we just really need to get out there and start putting it in on the ground. So that's fantastic. Any questions? No. Okay. Well, Nick Turner.
In terms of what? No, I guess the short answer is no. There's not really a consistent approach where we do take weeds and so the question was what happens when we take weeds and sediment out of the system, if I understand it correctly. So where we can, we'll always look to reuse them on site, particularly the sediments. So we'll get those tested. Sometimes they'll need to be treated, particularly with lime, and often they can be used, they can be reused on site. And some of the reuse options, I guess, is to build up of the sediment, to build up some areas that need it, potential for some landscaping mix, but they are subject, as I say, to some testing. An issue that is increasingly emerging for us in terms of dealing with these sediments is PFAS contamination. So that's something that we are needing to test for now and to manage. So unfortunately, where levels of contaminants within these systems, because essentially that's what they're designed to do, to capture these contaminants, where they are too high, then we have to dispose of them to landfill. But we certainly look to not do that in the first instance. And weeds, the same, we'll dewater those as much as possible, but yeah, looking to dispose of those. And interestingly, I mean, sort of back to that harvesting issue, some of the data that we have collected from the weeds that we've removed from site is that those weeds uptake quite a lot of nutrient themselves. So actually removing them from site is a net removal of nutrients from the system that would otherwise hit the river as well. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate. The next speaker, great presentation. The next speaker is Mark Richardson from Water Corporation, who will speak on Perth Peel Integrated Water Services Plan Project. Mark Richardson, as he's known, is an engineer with the asset planning and is involved with water source and network planning across WA. I asked him, you know, what is something that no one would really know about you, but I knew, was that he also sings in his part-time with the WA Symphony Orchestra. So if you see him there, then you'll know that he's not quite moonlighting. But anyway, there's a theme that will be coming up in terms of singing and Water Corporation. So anyway, I'll hand over to Mark.
I hate passcodes. I do. Right, start. Hi there. Thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. I thought I'd use this chance to talk about how we've tried to incorporate some of the water sensitive city objectives into our infrastructure planning and decision making in the Water Corp, across our water and wastewater, and also across some alternative water sources that we've had a look at as well. Our infrastructure planning kind of process, I guess, is part of that development process that Mike was talking about before. But it's a bit like the Queen Mary. It's a bit hard to move sometimes. So we've, in trying to apply some different thinking to that, it's, you know, there's been challenges, and we've achieved some things, but other things still are going to need some time. So I thought I'd sort of focus on what we've what we tried to do, what we were able to do, and through this project, and what we've still got to do. So let's go to the next one. So this, I guess, tells you a little bit about what we're trying to achieve with this project. So it's essentially a long-term planning project. We do these things once in a while, once every 10 years or so, where we look at our water services. This time is the first time we've tried to look at water and wastewater and drainage planning together. We've also looked at trying to incorporate non-potable planning for the first time into this study. So we started with the Perth Peel framework from the Department of Planning, trying to look at what the impact of the urban density targets would be on our servicing, and then looked to incorporate what the impact of climate and increasing regulatory pressures would be on our infrastructure planning. And we've cooperated quite extensively with WSUD on trying to get a handle on what the impact of non-potable requirements for the community going forward would be. So I guess that started with the realisation that the groundwater system, I guess, wasn't able to support community growth in the way that it had done in the past, and so we wanted to get a focus on, I guess, what that meant for our infrastructure decision making. So that I guess the focus areas we looked at was whether potable water would be required through our drinking water system to supplement any non-potable requirements in the future, and whether we would have to ever choose between potable and non-potable recycling of wastewater at various points in our system. So trying to essentially get, I guess, prepared so that we can inject into the planning process early enough, rather than doing it later in the development process. So I guess the way it had been going was that the people at WSUD and through the development industry were, I guess, coming up with roadblocks on groundwater being available for development, and then suggestions were to develop recycling schemes to support that requirement for public open space in some of those areas. And I guess we sort of realised that if we looked at the whole of the region, we could anticipate when some of those problems were going to occur, and then plan for it early so that we could inject into the planning process at the start rather than at the end when we're all scrabbling around and we end up being a constraint on development by not planning for it early enough. And I guess the other thing we were looking at was where would we actually need to invest in non-potable to service the non-potable needs of the city through infrastructure approaches versus policy approaches, those kinds of things. So moving on, our start point is to look at what are the change drivers for the future for us. If we're looking out to 2050, what things do we think are going to change in the future? And the obvious things for us are climate. What's the growth going to be? What technology might help us with servicing in the future? And what are the regulators going to do to us, I guess, whether or not the constraints are going to increase on us. And I guess in most of those areas, I've got a little diagram there that shows what our assessment, I guess, was of what the impact would be. Our dams, I guess, respond quite quickly to changes in climate. The groundwater system takes a little bit longer to get the impacts, I guess, of climate change, and through the regulatory process, it also it takes a while to get regulation change, so it defers those impacts a little bit. What else have I got there? Sorry, I'm blind as a bat. We were, I guess, looking at things like sea level rise as well, and trying to go through as many of those factors as we could. Some of them we, I guess, can't do in a huge amount of detail just because of the scope of the project. It's across the whole region, all services, there's a lot to do. So the challenge for us was incorporating the impacts of some of these change drivers at a whole of region level, and trying not to get bogged down in local impacts everywhere, and then trying to add it up and get resources to deal with that amount of work that we had to do. So I guess the questions we were asking in that case were what policy decisions could we make and what infrastructure decisions could we make now that would help us prepare for these changes in the future. And the outcome of all of this, I guess, is that there's a sort of a combination, I guess, of adaptive planning and then predictive planning for us. So how much do we respond at the last minute, and what of these factors can we actually predict for the future? So there's a bit of a combination of keeping our options open until the last moment and waiting for change to happen, versus predicting what we think is going to happen and then working earlier to get that response going. So I thought I'd just throw up the climate slide for the hell of it. So we've been using the DWER climate scenarios for the future. So we basically structured this process across potable and non-potable, and on 3 climate scenarios. So the wet, medium, and dry that DWER had developed previously. We've done modelling and looked at what the impact of that would be on our stream flow into our dams. So the one in the bottom right there is basically a 10-year moving average of our stream flow into our dams. You can see a quite frightening trend in stream flow reduction there. And then we've projected forward based on those future climate scenarios what we think will happen with stream flow in our dams. They're going to be wrong, their projections are always wrong, but they give us some idea. So the idea with doing this kind of thing is to go, okay, so if climate goes this way or that way, what pathways of decision making are most resilient, basically. So what if we make a decision to develop a particular water source or a different policy response, which of those gives us the most likelihood of a good outcome across all of those scenarios. So we've assessed the potential impacts of climate on surface water flows, on groundwater availability for our bores, as well as the non-potable kind of component, which we've had furious discussions with DWER about, and on what that might do for water demand for our system as well. So I'll focus mostly on the non-potable side of it here, because that's the sort of novel thing for this project. So historically, development in Perth, whether it's residential or industrial or horticultural, has sort of relied on or been supported by this sort of decentralised ability to put bores in where the location of the demand is across Perth. So you can see in this diagram there's green space bores that are the green dots. You've got yellow bores that are horticultural bores. And then you've got the purple ones there that are domestic bores. So as Perth's developed, these things are developed with the urban and industrial development. So if you looked so this is in the northeast corridor near Brabham and Ellenbrook and all that sort of thing. So if you were looking at that area in purple, that's the developable urban land. You'd expect, if the groundwater was available, that sequence of bore development would help support that community. So in the environment of climate change, we're finding that the groundwater is not available to do that, to follow that same process. So we've got to basically work out what we're going to do with that land before it develops, so that we can help Perth develop without constraining it through our lack of planning, essentially. So we've been working with DWER on that kind of thing, and what options are possible. So in some of the cases there, you'll see the yellow bores are underneath the urban land. So in those cases, when the land use changes, the licence will go over and they can use that water to then deal with public open space in the residential areas. We're expecting that there'll be fewer domestic bores in future urban development, just because the lot sizes are so small and people don't have the same requirement, or it doesn't justify the investment. But so after all of that, if you have horticultural licences that can be replaced, there are still supply gaps in some areas, and so what do we do with those? And that's where we come to this choice of, do we do recycling to meet that demand? Do we use the potable system to support that, or do we do policy responses to try and help that to happen, to keep the options open? So we use a spatial planning kind of approach to try and have a look across Perth at what the future requirements might be. So in conjunction with where we've looked at the what the non-potable water demand might be in the future. So the green space demand, we're looking at about 20 to 25 gigalitres across Perth. I think the current is, what is it, Dan? 60, something like that, across existing areas. Horticulture is obviously a bit of a crapshoot, but there's developments for where that might be required. So you've got the Peel Food Zone, you've got expansion of the Carabooda horticultural area up in, near Wanneroo, potentially some horticulture in the Swan Valley, and then you've got industrial expansion in Kwinana, which, so if you add all of those things up, you're in that sort of 50 to 100 gigalitres of future demand. So we've got about 300 existing across licensed and unlicensed users of the groundwater system. And then we've got the additional factor of long-term sustainable groundwater availability potentially declining. So then that creates a supply gap that we have to solve for in some way or other. I won't go into this one in too much detail, but that's our potable system. Is that actually viewable up there? We've got desalination plants in Binningup and Kwinana, and some groundwater schemes and some dams that don't get a huge amount of flow in them anymore. So that's what used to be an east to west system coming out of the dams is now a sort of a west to east kind of system where we have desalination plants on the coast and try and bring the water in. So we've done planning through this to look at what our options are for the future for potable. So we've got desalination's one option, potable recycling at all of our major wastewater treatment plants, or groundwater. So in the longer term, we're expecting that our groundwater, new groundwater schemes will have limits on them due to the climate change. The other responses we have to meet our potable requirements are things like water use efficiency, which Adele and various people try and keep on track for us, looking at leakage reduction in our system to make sure we're not wasting the water that we gather from our natural resources. And so through this study, the key issues we've looked at are what's the effect of urban densification on our future water demand. So we've recreated a new model to do that. Recycling versus desalination, how do we make that choice, whether we should be doing desalination future sources versus recycling future sources. And then what is the effect of potable recycling planning on non-potable recycling availability. So if we say we're going to, we would like to do a potable recycling scheme off a wastewater treatment plant, does that mean that we're depriving the community of something that they need to service a horticultural development or any other sort of development? So this sort of stuff is kind of new for us to think through these kind of issues and how we evaluate them. And so we've tried to take an approach where we're investigating how you would do whole of water cycle evaluation of this stuff rather than just thinking from our usual methodology, which is servicing what people ask us to service, essentially. So wastewater is a east to west system, so most of our wastewater treatment plants are on the western side. We typically just plan for water to flow in the similar direction that it does now. We have a number of different catchments that go to our treatment plants. We currently don't have a huge amount of ability to transfer between those catchments. It's a fairly rigid system. The water system's a lot more flexible. But we would typically just basically plan to upgrade our treatment facilities, and there's not a huge 5 minutes, okay, and concentrate on making sure that we have secure disposal for the wastewater to keep the sanitation objectives that we have and to meet our lowest environmental impact objectives. So I guess through this approach here, we've just looked at what our wastewater options were for the future in terms of so if we're looking at recycling wastewater, what costs in the wastewater system could we offset? So similar to what Sydney have been looking at in terms of trying not to transport the wastewater to the coast, that gives them a wastewater cost offset to do recycling in a particular location. So we're basically trying to get a handle on that. If you look at that plan, you can see there's a few mains that are going from east to west for the Eastern Corridor developments that you know, potentially you could look at whether or not that's an offset cost if you did inland recycling. Oops. So for the first time, we've done basically a full portfolio of non-potable source options for the future. So we've looked at basically any idea that people had in terms of wastewater recycling, subsoil drainage recycling. We've looked at centralised recycling out of our wastewater treatment plants, and we've looked at decentralised recycling through sewer mining, and looked at basically the cost sort of perspective of that. We've done a little bit on the development scale recycling, such as the stuff Josh was talking about. You can see that there's, you know, savings there to be made. That's an area we can, you know, we'll continue with, and basically trying to work out how we would support, I guess, industry and horticulture one thing, and then public open space is the other. Okay, so if I just quickly go into some examples of the way we're trying to assess things now. So our wastewater diversions typically get planned on a conveyance driver. So if one of our sewers is going to start surcharging and causing problems, we'll try and divert the wastewater away to a different spot. And in this case, we're diverting some water from our Beanyup catchment to our Alkimos catchment on that driver. But there's also a driver for us to have water going to Beanyup so that we have water available for our GWR scheme. So in terms of that kind of assessment, we're trying to do a whole of water cycle assessment of the economics of that, versus, let's say you wanted to do recycling at Alkimos for horticulture up there's a value of that, and there's a value of the potable water, and then trying to do an economic evaluation of that as a whole is a new thing for us, and we've made some steps towards doing that, and we're doing it right now, so I'd be interested to see what the results are when they come out. I guess the other thing we've got there is wastewater priorities. So one of the big things for us here is what choices do we need to make? So if you're looking at wastewater recycling at our Woodman Point plant, we're looking at potable recycling there, but there's also a large industrial growth down there. So are we going to have to choose between how much wastewater is available for non-potable versus potable? So I've said here basically that whole of water cycle evaluation is fundamental to getting the best results for the community, and that's where we're trying to get to. The other thing to consider is also there's upstream and downstream impacts. So if you recycle somewhere, downstream is getting the brine. So that, in this case, if we recycle for potable at Woodman Point, then our existing recycling at Quirp gets a different feed stream, and we have to upgrade for those things as well. So I guess I'll come to the crux of the matter here, which is economic evaluation. So in looking at how we deal with non-potable servicing across Perth, the cheapest thing to do is to use groundwater. The next cheapest things to do is to do a broad-scale water efficiency campaign to make sure everyone uses less water so that you create a space for development. And then the next is water trading, so getting people to sell water to each other to try and direct it from the lowest value use to the highest value use, that kind of thing. And then the last thing you want to do is new infrastructure. So if we're talking about large-scale recycling infrastructure, it's quite a risky proposition. There's always a demand risk. Is that going to come on, or is it not going to come on? So we've looked through this study at potential responses based on what can you achieve in water efficiency, what can you achieve in infrastructure, prioritised infrastructure for non-potable servicing, and then a balance between the two. So we've tried to assess the amenity value of the non-potable water and what you're giving up if you don't service it, basically. So if you go through climate change in the next 30 years, there's going to be some people who are going to have an impact that no one's going to service. They're just like hobby farmers or whoever it is in the middle of nowhere. They're going to get, you're not going to build something to service them. But if you're an industry or you're a horticultural area, you've got that option of actually getting an investment in there. Even in some cases where the economic outcome for the state is what you want to do, the market won't actually fund it. So if you've got a value to the horticulturalists of 30 or 40 cents for that water, but it's going to cost you $1, you've got to work out some way of getting it from the 30 cents to $1 so that you can actually get the thing to happen if you don't have any alternatives. So in developing this approach, we've worked very closely with WSC. DLGSC have been doing some awesome work in the public open space strategy. So we've been inputting to that, and we're so many steps down the track from where we were a while ago when we started this project. So the things we've learned are what the scale of the problem is, where it connects into our decision making, our normal decision making, and that if we don't plan, and do the broader scale planning and get it into the development process early, then we're going to basically be constraining growth. And you do it without realising it. If you're not ready, developments just start and then they go, oh, there's nothing there for me. It's going to cost too much, and then that development stops, and we're kind of oblivious, if you know what I mean. I guess one of the positive outcomes of it has been just developing a shared understanding with WER and DLGSC of what the problem is, and that's been a very rewarding process for me, and hopefully others. So basically trying to organise ourselves to get our paperwork solutions there before we make the investment decisions. Yeah, that's about it really. Next steps on the right there, we're just trying to summarise it all up now and get an action plan that we can work with across government. So we're trying to basically get a report that we can work with across government to get into those cooperative planning kind of approaches that are going to get some impact, I hope. That's me.
Thank you very much, Mark. We've got time for one question. Oh, there we go.
Oh, Susan. Right.
Next steps with the actions you've got input to the land planning process. So, GTLH has got the sub-regional structure plans coming up for us to have a more important update later this year. How do you think we can sort of overlay what you've done into that process in a way that's effective, in the sense that those structure plans will have enough leverage for those structure plans to actually inform the subsequent plans? Do you think we can do that?
Yes, well, I guess we're trying to focus on doing corridor planning across all the services and trying to work out what, I guess, what infrastructure is going to be in that area, but also making sure we've got some sort of strategic approach to the water management in the area, and that's obviously your job. Now we're somewhat prepared as a water corporation for what it means and how far we're prepared to go. Then that's helps, I think. All right. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And yeah, a lot to take in, and those presentations will be available afterwards. Next presenter is Carolyn Oldham, who is talking on the performance of green walls irrigated with greywater, water use, and for thermal comfort. So Carolyn probably doesn't need much introduction here. She's been involved with the Water Sensitive Cities initiative for some time, particularly in the groundwater space. She's a professor at the University of WA in the School of Civil, Environmental and Mining Engineering. She earned a Bachelor of Science with honours in chemistry and has a PhD in environmental engineering, which was into the investigation into the effects of turbulence on oxygen patchiness in a lake. I don't know which lake, but anyway, doesn't say. Yeah, since that time, Carolyn has diversified her interests across working with hydrologists, oceanographers, estuarine and groundwater scientists and engineers. So I'll pass that on. Oh, sorry, the other thing that, one thing you don't know about Carolyn is that, or you might not know, is that she's a yoga instructor. So she asked me to give a bit of a plug, Yoga West at Shenton Park for some, there we go.
Speaking of that, you've all been sitting there for an hour and a half. I suggest you all stand up. I'm also really, really happy for you to continue standing as I talk, so you choose what you want to do. An hour and a half is more than enough for just about all of us. I will try to use this remote control. So I'm going to talk to you about a project that we've not presented so far in the CRC projects. You don't have to sit down to listen. I'm sure you can stand up and listen at the same time. Your choice. this project has been going for 3 years now, but we're still feels like we're in the thick of it. And so I want to, this is really a introduction to the project, even though the CRC is finishing, this is an introduction to the project. And so I'm going to take you through fairly slowly a background to the project and what we have built, knowing that we'll probably through new Waterways in particular, we'll come back and give you the results of the project over the next couple of years. First of all, I wanted to talk about, there's all these words we used, and I notice in the trivia question at the very beginning of the conference, there was a question about what's a living wall, what's a green wall? And the answer was actually the exact opposite of what I'm about to say. So there is a diversity of views out there. When we first came to this project, we did a big literature review across the world, and everyone is using different terms. So we just said, this is what most people in the world, how they're using these terms, so we're going to stick with that. But note that it is different to what you were told as the answer to the trivia question. So green walls, we talk about in general, about green systems next to buildings. There are some green walls termed living walls, and these are the not just our definition, but most people are using living walls to describe modular vertical systems. So these are the pots that might be installed up a wall, or even as you see on the on my right, your left. That's good. It's like teaching yoga. Okay. So you'll see there's both the pot plants that you can mount up the wall and also the panels that could be pre-planted and then installed up on a wall. So those are termed living walls. There's also green facades, and these are generally climbing plants that are growing up a building, and they can be both attached, and the most commonly known attached green facade is ivy. Yep, or in the photograph here, it's nice and it's obviously deciduous. I'm not sure what the species is, but that's planted in the ground and then it's attached to the building and it's growing up. You can also have detached green facades, and there's a photograph there. So this is when either the plant is rooted in the ground or grown in a planter, and there's a space between the planter or the plant and the building, and these are typically used on the front of balconies or verandas, like the photographs you've seen there. Green walls have been used for millennia. Yeah, we know that. They've been used for shade and also for aesthetics. Grapevines in the Roman villas were being used for shade a long time ago. What we're starting to get is a understanding of how the different features of a green wall affects different parts of its functionality, and we need to do that to be able to design them in our future urban design. So can we tweak a certain part of the plant or part of the design to optimize the effect that we want in that particular system? So the recent understandings, we're starting to get a better handle on how they provide thermal benefits, the energy savings in a building, that they purify air, a number of the functionalities that Billy Giles-Corti mentioned this morning, passive acoustic insulation as well, and also increased biodiversity in the urban environment. So in a place like, so green walls are used, green facades are used an awful lot in the tropical areas and also in temperate regions like Melbourne, for example. Can we use them in Perth where we have these long dry periods? We don't want to be irrigating green walls. It may not be the right approach. So can they survive without irrigation in a Perth climate? That was one of the key questions we were asked at the beginning of our research project. So a key question then becomes, can we irrigate them with greywater? Can we recycle greywater from an apartment, for example, and place a green facade on the balcony to provide thermal comfort to the apartment and all the benefits we have and energy savings? So when we first started this project, we were looking at all different types of green walls. If we put as an objective, we want to be able to irrigate these with greywater, then the health requirements essentially force us to use green facades. The modular green living walls systems tend to leak water a lot. That's part of their cooling effect, is the leaking water. If we're using greywater, the health department will not approve those sort of leaky systems.
So it forces us to go to green facades, and that's what this project evolved around, using greywater to irrigate green facades, with a specific objective to, possible down the track, use these on balconies in apartment blocks. So there was some early work done by, in the early days, the CRC. Actually, it was done in the Cities for Water Supply Catchments body of work, done by Fowler at Monash University, where they did laboratory scale systems irrigated by greywater. And they did a whole lot of measuring to see, monitoring to see how they performed. And they found the plants attenuated most of the total nitrogen, the total suspended solids, and most of the BOD. But you look at their systems, they're single pots, they're in a very controlled environment, beautifully manicured greywater, very reliable greywater. The question was, there were two key questions: can we take them out into the real world? And can we take them to the real world in Perth with their long, arid, with our hot summers? So the key question, this is sort of repeating, key questions that we had: can we take them outside the lab in our climate? What would suitable media be? What would suitable plants be for Perth? What are the irrigation requirements? Can greywater provide sufficient water to irrigate these systems? How much water does that plant use? Are you going to get a lot of outflow? Now, if you're irrigating with greywater, one of the key questions we had: do you want outflow or not? Is it better for the plants to use all the water so that you have no outflow, and then you don't have to deal with replumbing the excess greywater into the toilets and the health implications of that? So there was a key question: what's the final use of the system, of the water that comes out? What's the pollutant removal performance, maintenance costs, and, as I said, the reuse of the outflow? Then we start to get this nexus between the water and the energy use. So what's the temperature reduction behind the planter or the facade? Is it due to the plant, or is it just due to shade? Could a shade cloth, much cheaper, much less management, could a shade cloth on a balcony provide exactly the same benefits? Summer versus winter effects, impacts of planter orientation. There's certain sides of the apartment block it's good to deploy these on, other ones, forget it. Impact of plant species selected, and finally the energy savings. So this was a huge number of questions that we had about taking these systems into real life. We were working, Department of Communities funded this research via the CRC. They were working at that time on the Bentley Regeneration Project, and they really wanted a site local to that project, and Bentley Primary School put up their hand. So this is the school. We have constructed green facades, and you'll see them in a second, according to 3 different orientations: 2 north-facing, 1 east-facing, and 1 west-facing. The greywater here, the black star, is from the student toilet block, and it's from their hand basins. So the hand basins outflow plus a drinking fountain outflow came into a greywater system. It was a Greyflow Pro system that are commercially available, and from there it got distributed out to these green facades. The design took quite a long time to actually come up with a system we thought was feasible and buildable at the primary school. The construction went from July to November. We built them out of Core 10 because it's being used more and more in urban design these days. We finally installed them. We put the greywater, the purple pipes, you see the subsurface irrigation, the dripper lines. We planted. There was a whole process of plant species selection according to the different orientations, and mulched them. So this is what the systems look like. And we put little benches in the middle of them so the school children can actually, and they do, they go and sit on those during their breaks. This is what they look like just in January. So they've had 2 years now of growth. So 2 north-facing planters, we have the usual, some plants need to be replaced, you see that. Okay, so that's what they look like. So now we monitored these to death because we wanted to actually be able to answer those questions that we had been asked. So the very first thing is all around the water use. So I'm going to get a bit technical here. We had inflow coming in, that was from greywater. We had outflow, which we wanted to monitor. We also have evaporation coming from the soil and the plant, and we have transpiration coming from the plant itself. And then we had a whole lot of media in the middle, which can accumulate water as well. So if we're going to do a water balance of the planter, what water comes out must be what came in minus the transpiration, minus evaporation, and minus what's stored in the water. Now, some of these terms are terribly hard to monitor, so we lumped them together like good engineers. And we said plant transpiration, evaporation, as is traditionally done, we lump that together into evapotranspiration. And we also, to start with, lumped together the stored water and evapotranspiration and just called it the net stored water. What was stored in the media after the plants had done, after the evaporation had occurred, after the plants had taken what they needed. And these we could monitor. So we could monitor the inflow at the pump. We were monitoring the volumes coming in and going out. The outflow was really tricky because these systems can dribble a couple of drops every half hour as outflow in summer, or if a rain event occurs at the same time as an irrigation event, they can really flood. So we had to design our own outflow device. Carlos Ocampo is just brilliant at this type of thing. He gutted a rain gauge and recreated an outflow device that we're using on all of them. And then we have soil moisture sensors. So this is the type of data. Now, I'm not going to go into a full analysis of the data, but I wanted to show you the type of data that we're now getting. So we have a weather station on site, and so we're measuring local rainfall every 5 minutes. We're also measuring the irrigation. So rainfall is coming in. Our planters are more or less exposed to the rainfall, depending on the orientation. We know how much water is going out from the Greyflow Pro system, and that's distributed out across the 5 different planters. And so we can see the irrigation rate, all those blue bars, and it's noted that there's a number of different irrigation regimes that we used. In the first few months, we were irrigating with scheme water every day initially, and then we started to move to 5 days a week. Remember, these plants are from greywater, from school children, so they will get greywater irrigation 5 days a week, nothing on the weekends. So we slowly transitioned the plants over to a 5-day irrigation cycle to get them established, and then we finally switched to greywater irrigation, and that's regime 2. So you can see immediately the volumes come down. They're also quite variable because it depends how much the students wash their hands after they've been to the toilet, and whether it's hot and they're drinking water at the fountains. So it's quite variable. And I wanted to say that COVID has impacted this quite a lot. This is 2019, where we have quite nice data. 2020 is a mess because we have periods where the schools were closed. They were being encouraged to use alcohol to wash their hands all the time. And so things really got messy in 2020. But essentially the regime 2 is when we're irrigating with greywater 5 days a week. As you start going into the summer, the greywater supply was not sufficient to keep the plants alive. So we started to shandy the system. We started to use greywater and then a top up with scheme water. And then when the school is closed, we have to turn over to greywater. And over the summer, to switch over to scheme water. And in the summer, we were having to irrigate 7 days a week with scheme water. The panel on the bottom in the green shows our outflow. So the outflow, and this is outflow being measured every 5 minutes, I think it is. So we're picking up outflow very rapidly in response to either rainfall or the irrigation event. And you can see, I think the interesting thing is once we get to the summer, see under regime 4, where we're starting to irrigate every day, which we needed to for the plants, but we're also getting quite much larger outflow. If we had an objective in your urban design or your apartment design to have no outflow, you'd want to tweak that a whole lot. So the irrigation rate needs to come down to ensure there is no leakage out of these systems. Over the water use, we found that, and sorry, one other thing we did in the planters, we had both deciduous and non-deciduous plants species used. So we could start to get what's the difference in water use between deciduous and non-deciduous. In the cooler months, so I've got photographs there of the planter on the right is deciduous, obviously the one on the left is non-deciduous. There's about a 1 litre a day difference in their water use, the plant's water use. In the warmer months, you've got leaves on both systems. There's still a difference between deciduous and non-deciduous. It's interesting. Now, coming back to water use, we talked about transpiration and evaporation. Both of those hook across into thermal comfort. Okay, both transpiration and evaporation are you're losing heat to the atmosphere, you're losing water and heat, and therefore it cools, and that's having an effect on the temperature that is felt behind the green wall and indeed in the apartment where you have a green facade in front of it. So we had all these questions about not just water use but also thermal comfort and ultimately energy savings if you can deploy these green facades. So we monitored up this system like Joel, we were talking earlier. We can monitor up these systems heavily, put temperature sensors, wind sensors, radiation sensors, humidity sensors in front of the green facade, behind the green facade. These sensors are monitoring every 30 seconds throughout the day, and we'll run that for a week at a time. We have to be careful that the children don't run into these systems. So we schedule these fairly carefully, usually in the school holidays. Again, I'm not going to take you into the data in detail, but this is the type of images we are starting to get. So this is for the north-facing facade in July. Note July, cool month. Yeah. The panel on the top shows as you move from the bottom of the top panel to the top of the top panel, we're moving across the system from ambient air, meaning the air well in about 4 metres in front of the facade, to just in front of the green layer, in the green layer, behind the green layer, starting to get in the gap. So we talk about the gap, which is behind the facade but in front of the wall. So that might be your veranda, yeah, your balcony. So we call back gap, 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 3 sensors in the gap, and then finally the external wall. The top panel is with the facade. So that's showing that in the middle of the day, the temperature of the external wall is sitting at around 20 degrees, maybe 25 degrees. Right next door to it, we did the same measurements on an same external wall, but with no green facade. And in July, that external wall is getting up to 45 degrees. So you can only imagine what it would be in a day in February. This is the type of data we're analysing right at the moment. So we're looking at temperature differences in the gap, external wall with facade, without facade. We've also done the experiment with the shade cloth. We put shade cloth instead of a facade and then compared the temperature benefits of the two systems. So we're grappling with this huge amount of data that's coming through at the moment. So what I thought I'd just show you is the findings so far. So this project won't finish for another year or so, as I mentioned, but this is what our conclusions so far. So the water use, the average water use overall is about 2 litres per metre squared of garden per day. And in summer, it's about 8.5 litres per metre squared per garden bed today. So as long as you've got grey water that can irrigate that amount, then you're good. There were no outflows. On average, there were no outflows in summer. There are outflows in winter. Nutrients were, interestingly, the health department was involved in this, and they were very interested in what the outflow water quality was. The media and the mulch that we use for our plants leach, in the first few years, leach far more nutrients than the grey water that we put in. We were using clean greywater, hand basins. So the greywater was remarkably clean going in, and what comes out is what you'd expect from media and mulch leaching and plants leaching water. So there's some interesting questions in the need for regulation, or how we regulate that outflow in terms of reuse, if that's what you want to do. Temperature gap, the gaps in so the temperatures in the gap. So think of this as the temperature, the thermal benefit you might have if you were sitting on that veranda or balcony with a green facade in front of you. In warm weather, the gap was up to 4 degrees cooler than the ambient air. In cool weather, the gap is up to 2 degrees warmer than ambient air. So those plants are moderating the temperature. They're providing a much more buffered environment inside your balcony. Of the building, the temperature of the building, in warm weather, the external wall behind a facade was more than 17 degrees cooler than an external wall without a facade. And in warm weather, the external wall behind a north-facing facade was up to 2 times warmer than ambient air. So it didn't get those real drops in temperature that we sometimes experience overnight. The external wall behind the facade didn't experience that. So while we haven't translated that into actual energy savings, dollar values, we can now take that and input it into an energy model for buildings, a building energy model. The final thing, which we were asked quite a lot at the beginning, was can we get the same thing with the shade sail? We could quantify, we could show that the shade sail only cooled the gap, the veranda, about 50% compared to a facade. It doesn't achieve, the plant itself is doing 50%, doing a lot of the cooling. And in warm weather, the external wall behind the shade sail was significantly warmer than behind the facade. So again, it's not cooling the external wall or the gap as much as a green layer does. So I want to say that this project would only be possible with an amazing team behind it. Department of Communities, certainly. John Savell, it was his baby, and it's been great to have his support over these years. And then the project steering group, which has been very engaged, and it's been great working with them. Bentley Primary School, the principal there, Water Corporation, DWER, DBCA, Department of Health, Department of Education, City of Canning, and Monash University. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I think we've got time for one question here. No?
Stuff that we're all trying to measure and acknowledge. They'd look better.
Okay. Did everyone hear what Shelley said? One of the things we're finding from the international literature, which I found really fascinating from other countries, was some developers are now putting their air conditioning intake pipes into the cavity behind a green facade, because those intake pipes are now taking air in that is sometimes 20 to 30 to 50 or 40 degrees cooler than would be if you had it on a hot tin roof or even on an external wall without. So the energy savings there for air conditioning would be really huge, and that's what they're finding in other parts of the world.
Thank you, Carolyn. I wish we had a green wall close by, so at lunchtime we could take a break and do some yoga, get some zen. Maybe in a few years' time, the next venue. Next speaker that we have is Nick Turner. So Nick is talking on the feasibility of MAR, which is managed aquifer recharge using subsoil drainage water. When does it stack up? So Nick is from the Water Corp. He is a pioneer, and when I was working there, he's certainly recognised as a pioneer in groundwater replenishment. So he's the guy that led the team that got groundwater replenishment happening. And I remember going to a talk at Water Corp and Nick talking about some of the trials and tribulations, and indicating that negotiating the regulatory environment was one of the hardest things about the actual exercise. But he's still got most of his hair, so it couldn't have been that bad. In addition to, so Nick's worked not only at the Water Corp, but he's also worked in consulting, mainly in the water sector, contracting, marketing, research, and he was named Australian Water Professional of the Year for WA in 2018. In his spare time, he is also a singer, and you can also, if you go to the Fremantle Arts Centre, as I occasionally get dragged along to do, you might see Nick up on the turf, on the dance floor, kicking up the turf. So anyway, I'll pass it on to Nick.
It's amazing I've got time to work, isn't it? So a couple of plugs. My Pogues tribute band, The Rogues, is playing at the Windsor this Wednesday for St Patrick's Day, starting 5 o'clock, 3 sets. It's going to be big, 6-piece band. And my originals band, the Nick Turner Conspiracy, is playing Gypsy Tappers in Fremantle next Wednesday, week Wednesday. But thus far, my musical career has managed to earn me enough money to keep me in full-time work at the Water Corporation. All right, let's get on with this. Okay, so this talk is focusing on the northeast corridor of Perth, which, if you're familiar with the area, is it's low-lying. So you're looking at those two photos on the right. There's not enough water in summer. There's too much in winter. That bottom photo is the future Brabham shopping centre, right across from Whiteman Edge Station. And so it's waterlogged. And the way to mitigate that is to put no, too far away. Is to put a bucket of fill, so that's Whiteman Edge development, so that's up to 4 metres of fill to keep the areas dry. And if you look at the figure on the left, all those grey areas are less than 1 metre above ground level, so it's seasonally inundated, so very tricky for development. And if you can see those dots on those maps, as Richo put on his presentation, this is actually Richo's slide, there are an awful lot of bores there. All those green bores are superficial bores, and all of the red ones are leadable bores. So there is a very large amount of servicing of water going on from the existing groundwater, okay? But we've run out, so we need more. So subsoil drainage, what is it? I would imagine most of you know this, but essentially if you're trying to develop on that inundated land, you import fill, you put subsoil drainage in, and those drains, well, so the fill then attenuates that water. Instead of getting the usual stormwater flow where it just all slams out in 2 days, it actually holds it back in the soil profile, so you get the stuff coming through slowly, so you've got some chance of getting a treatment plant in that might actually be able to deal with that water, okay? And the trick to this is working out what that attenuation is, what the treatment you need to do that is, and stitching enough of them together to see if you can make it work. So that's basically the last bullet point there. And the answer to these options has been Water Corporation focused to date. Can it work? Is it financially competitive? And I guess the competitive stuff, you know, groundwater's gone. The baseline source is stream water, drinking water, 250 a cubic metre. That's expensive, but that's the step change that we're going through. So we organised a magical mystery tour to Adelaide. Adelaide is the centre of excellence for getting money off other people to build water recycling systems. They've got 3 major wastewater recycling schemes, one going north growing veggies, one going through the CBD doing green space, and one going south growing wine grapes, which is an excellent end use. And they've also got a very large number of these stormwater MAR schemes, okay? That one there, actually, so this is about stakeholders. So left to right in that photo is Leon van der Linden from City of Swan. It's Craig Rayner from Pete, Shane McSweeney from RPS, who are the consultants to Pete and also shown as a key player in alternative water. Simon Higginson, who was my tame hydrogeologist for GWR, and Dan Ferguson, who's sitting here. So we had multiple regulators, developers, consultants, all looking at these schemes. This scheme, one thing to, look at the wetlands on the right there, right? These schemes, they created beautiful places in crap holes, frankly. These places were just dust bowls, and these were awesome assets for the community. This is the place you took your kids for a picnic on a Sunday. It was really cool, literally. And if you look at the bottom photo there, that is about 20 k's of pipelines that they did by tunnelling through the suburbs. Extraordinary. For $20 million they did that. Water Corp would cost a fair bit more than that, but that scheme went across 4 council jurisdictions, had 1 pump set to service all of that, and extraordinary piece of work for that amount of money. Now, if you get to the bottom of those bullet points though, the design yield is 400 megalitres a year. Megalitres, not gigalitres. I'm used to dealing in gigs. 400 meg is not much. And it recharged 90 megalitres last year. That's now 2 years ago, right? That is not very much water at all. There's a whole set of reasons why that didn't work as well as it could do. And in coming up with the design locally, we tried to address that, and I'll talk about that. But bottom line, that scheme is about as pushing the envelope as you can in terms of money. Oh yeah, and last thing, if you look on the left-hand photo at the top, there's a blank flange there because it was built to a budget. They couldn't afford the second UV disinfection unit, so that's why it's only got the one. So key learnings, around 50 schemes, 6 to 8 gig total. We have 1 groundwater replenishment scheme in this city, and that's worth 28 gig. So these are tiny, right, and they don't produce as much water. So the scale thing is not there. Majority builders response to Millennium Drought, and 250 mil to get 8 gig with at least 100 mil in federal funds. It's amazing what a catalyst free money can be to doing something, okay? Everywhere we saw it when we were over there. The amenity benefits, I've talked about that. Another key learning was the guys that run these things call themselves water farmers, getting the wetland to work, keeping the carp down, controlling the ducks, harvesting the reeds, dealing with the stuff that Kate was talking about is their main job. The black boxes are not the hard bit. It takes several years to achieve a stable operation, a bit like starting up a garden or working a farm, and the actual yield is commonly 25 to 35% of design. And some of them are great. The one that we showed, I showed before, works really well. Some have never operated, okay? $30 million in federal funding went towards one scheme where they didn't do any hydrogeological assessment. They drilled the bores, and when they started to recharge, the water was literally squirting out of the aquifer in people's back gardens because it was unconfined, right? So complete write-off of money. So key learning, do your homework first, all right? And yeah, the other thing was this, and this is a challenge locally, the great majority of those schemes are in fractured rock aquifers, so it's really easy to get the water in the ground, and the aquifers are quite shallow, and therefore the treatment that you need is significantly less than what we need locally. That's the unfortunate, when our aquifers are awesome, but they're not as simple in terms of getting the water in the ground there. And I've repeated myself at the bottom there. So, what does that roll up to locally? So cost effectiveness, as always, getting the water into the ground, supply, demand, balance and location, I'll talk about that later. Get enough water to use given above and environmental requirements. If you've got a high value wetland down gradient of this system, what is the right amount of water that should go through to that, both in terms of quality and in terms of quantity? And how do you then make those decisions? That's part of building the regulatory frameworks for this that we need to do. And getting clarity on the regs as a result of that. And defining a sustainable, cost-effective operating model. I haven't gone near costs and price recovery for this thing today. The only thing I will observe about that is whenever I meet with anyone on this, we can all agree that someone else should be paying for it. Okay, that's about the only thing people can agree on. But we need a way of getting this stuff to be cost-effective if these different approaches are going to happen, right, at a whole of government level. And I'll leave that there. All right, so taking all that into account, how do we think we could make it work locally? I'll start at the right hand of that slide. That aquifer depth of 200 metres, right, and an aquifer thickness of 150 metres, and it's a tight aquifer, right? All that translates into a bucket of money to drill the bore, okay, and then a bucket of money to do that set of black boxes in the middle, the ozone BAC stuff. in order to get a water quality where you can reliably recharge that water. If you do not achieve the right quality, you're not going to get the water in the ground and you've wasted your money, okay? So, and that is the hydrogeological reality of the Leederville Aquifer in the Northeast Corridor. So everything then folds back from that. If you look on the left-hand side, that's the collecting the subsoil drainage. One of the key learnings from Adelaide, one of the reasons they couldn't get the yield was because they had aquifer storage and recovery schemes, right? So water goes in the same bore that it comes out. That means that bore can only do one thing at a time, right? So if you're using the water coming out, you can't collect. So a lot of the water goes past. The other thing is that it gives you real flexibility if you can transfer. So your bore is going into the confined aquifer, you get the pressure response and you can suck the water out 5 to 10 k's away. That's what we do with groundwater replenishment, okay? That means a council can put a bore in 5 k's away and have a groundwater allocation that you can demonstrate hydrogeologically. Huge reduction in cost for conveyance to get the water there, all right? So that's a big plus. Bearing in mind the level of treatment that was needed, we adopted Water Corporation design standards for the treatment because local councils, I can't see them having the capacity to run a treatment plant like that. We are not cheap, we are very reliable, but we're not cheap. But at the flip side, the water coming out, it would basically be the same as a normal council bore into the Leederville Aquifer. So that's an upside. I tried really hard to get the wetlands into the local design because they look so funky in Adelaide, but you don't actually need one here. Once you've got that level of treatment, there is no, in terms of treating the water to get the required standard, from an engineering perspective, you don't need it. From an amenity perspective, I think they're awesome, and I think we need a way of understanding what investment you put in for what kind of wetland, for what kind of development. But that's, I've got to get the water in the ground first, that's my priority. Okay, so it's interesting having seen Carolyn's talk at that one primary school level and then Mark doing the whole city, so I just went for a corridor. But really we needed to understand how much water you're going to get from the whole of the corridor and then what do you do with that? Do you go local scale, 19 schemes, each one of those coloured areas there is a potential subsoil drainage catchment, okay? Not all of them will actually deliver. There's a Lexia triangle about halfway down there where you don't need to put fill in, so you don't need subsoil drainage, so that's not a yield. But we got RPS to do this work, and if you go decentralised, local scale, 19 schemes, combine some of those into hubs, which I'll explain more in a minute, you get 4 schemes, or you do the kind of Water Corporation, make it a huge thing and combine everything into one big one. There's a significant downside of that for this particular corridor, because as you can see, there's 2 sets of development and then an awfully long way between them, which made a difference. Okay, so this is the hubs approach. Hopefully you can see that slightly more clearer than I can, because there is 1, 2, 3, 4 hubs there. So you can see there's breakout areas that show you combine 3 or 4 of these discharge areas into one hub to get scheme yields of 2 gig to 4 gig a year. That's a decent amount of water, and a treatment plant capacity range 7 to 10 meg a day. Okay, that's in winter when the water is flowing at its highest, but that's about the same as our Cadadat wastewater treatment plant in Mandurah, so it's the sort of thing that Water Corporation could possibly do. Get up to 4 gig by 2040 and 4 gig by 2040, ultimately up to about 8.5 gig. So that's a decent amount of water, okay? And then that's just focusing in on the one that is actually around the Brabham development. So what you can see there is about 3 or 4 collection points for that subsoil drainage, where you put them all to one point in the southwest corner and you recharge there. You then get the aquifer pressure benefits that can deliver the water to wherever you need it within 5 or so k's. That's the hubs approach. So, and there it is, look, in a sort of a P&ID kind of setup. What you can see in the bottom middle is that is the treatment plant, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 subsoil drainage catchments collecting to get to that plant, and then you are pushing that water out to 4 recharge bores, and the one at the bottom is a representation of the water then coming out of the ground somewhere else. So that's the concept and the scale of that particular hub approach. Scaling's findings. So the hub concept is the most cost effective. It's still not cheap. This costs more than scheme water, okay? It does. That's the engineering reality of this. We tried everything we could to get the cost down, but it still costs more than supplying drinking water. So There is a world that Richard's kind of looking at where you just use scheme water. You just irrigate with drinking water and you accept that. Is that the right thing to do? I'm not sure, but all I can do is populate that with accurate data about what it actually does. Local scale, bearing in mind the cost of that treatment and recharge bore, it costs a fortune for one small scheme that's 200 or 300 meg a year. It just doesn't stack up, okay? Interesting thing that's been developing, Shane McSweeney at RPS has been driving this for the Brabham development on behalf of Pete. Using direct supply and supplementation in dry months with limited groundwater allocation, right? So your stormwater MAR scheme or your subsoil drainage MAR scheme lasts, let's say, up until the end of January, and then through February and March, you've got a small amount of groundwater and you supplement with that. That is something that you don't have that high cost treatment plant, you don't have that very high cost Leaderville bore, so your unit costs are way lower, okay? Interesting. The whole of corridor, high cost for conveyance to common location for the approach, so that 5 to 10 k's are nothing in between, didn't do anything for the economic, and also you're crossing a railway line and 2 highways, I think it was, which makes it expensive. The other part there is you don't have confidence about when different areas are going to get developed, when different end uses are going to happen. Thank you. So your demand-supply balance is not flash, and in fact the demand-supply imbalance over time is a challenge for all of those options, because you need water to keep the grass green, you're generating water by getting a development, getting those things to line up is lottery basically. Other learnings and insights. So great work driven by Mel Bromley at Dwyer. Mel has identified that if you look at the trades and transfers of all those existing licences that Richo talked about, the gap is not massive, okay? So the house is not burning down there. 3 years ago, everyone was panicking there wasn't going to be enough water. There's a lot of water sloshing around there. It's just a question of getting it organised enough such that people know what there is and where it is and how they can get it and paying a price for it. The hassle with that is that will satisfy a great deal of demand. So what you'll end up with in terms of demand not met is all these little bits all over the place. Trying to get a scheme to get that to work is going to be a real pain, frankly. So it does not help with cost and effectiveness. Single large end use. Key finding, if there is a single major large end use, being it regional open space or similar, you've got your inertia of 200 or 300 meg a year demand already there. Also, those things, they actually need their own subsoil drainage system, so they are their own source, right? So that is the catalyst to be able to do a MAR scheme from day one, okay? So, and then direct supply. If direct supply for a local scheme adds up, a number of these could be combined when yields are sufficient to deliver a hub scheme with seasonal storage. So you start small and beautiful, right? 4 different developments, and then you stitch them together when you've got enough of them to do a MAR scheme. So when does it, brackets, might it, stack up? So that single and major end use that I've talked about. So the other one, identify a hub of localised direct supply schemes and combine for a MAR scheme when scale is achieved. It works better with that demand-supply imbalance because you're not creating the monster of the big scheme and trying to get rid of all the water and create the water in one go. Costs is order of magnitude lower at inception. Maximise the yield in the longer term once you've got the MAR scheme in place. But this is the tricky bit. The significant planning and coordination between multiple agencies, developers, councils, Dwyer Water Corporation. So imagine transfer of ownership between a local council and water corporation after 10 years because it's become too hard for the council to operate. Imagine Dwyer needing to understand how the MAR comes into the equation to get it into the allocation limit stuff. Water Corporation would need to have certain design standards in place to be able to walk on the site. You've got to get all that stuff to happen. And the biggest one, I think, is at Hydropolis. I heard a great term, Frankenstein landscapes, which is where you've got developments that have their own concept of how they're going to do their drainage, and one puts it that way and one puts it that way, and they don't meet up in the middle. And so when you're trying to get stuff to drain all to the common point, it doesn't happen, right? And then when you try and collect it, it costs a bloody fortune and doesn't happen again. So to me, that is, in terms of, that is a viable way that this can happen, but it needs an awful lot of coordination, okay? Okay, and then, so that's what, I'll skip that. Already done that. So, again, so picking up on Richo's work, 30 gig across the Perth Peel region, okay, of this water. That is a lot of water, okay? That's half a desal plant. Now, yields may be reduced. It's interesting, Kate, that you picked up, you mentioned PFAS, because my follow-up question was going to be, what about PFAS? Because we had to exclude about 25% of the catchment in order for the yields of this because of pure air-based, right? And I think PFAS and other contaminants are going to be a big issue moving ahead with this stuff. Again, the supply-demand balance. But then, if those trades and transfers can satisfy the demand, what else could you use that water for? So Richard mentioned the horticulture, the Swan Valley, that might be the best way. Augment drinking water supplies. If that water's going in the ground and it's not needed locally because you've done your trades and transfers, maybe that goes to a IWSS, to a drinking water supply allocation benefit. And then the other one, picking up more on what Carolyn was talking about, maybe if you're living in the northeast corridor where it's 45 degrees, you know, for a month on end, your amenity benefit should be higher. You put more water into those communities so you're getting the canopy cover and you're getting the green grass. Because I literally live across the road from the Whitegum Valley development. It's awesome, right? Get the doctor in every day. That's not what it's like up there. That'll do me. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you. I think we've got one or two.
Run, Forrest.
Okay, Nick, I just didn't quite catch what you were talking about with the direct supply.
Yep.
Can you just run me through that again?
All right, so if you are trying to manage aquifer recharge of seasonally produced water from day one, the cost of treatment and the cost of the bore is really high, right? Because of this subsoil drainage, you get attenuation in the soil profile, okay? So that water holds back. You may be able to get that water to use it for irrigation in the first few months of summer. Now, this is actually Shane's work and Carl Davis from RPS, so I'm sort of paraphrasing their work. And what they have there is they have a groundwater allocation to supplement that for when they run out, okay? And bearing in mind that trades and transfers thing, it may be possible to do 3 or 4 of those schemes with so let's say 1/3 the groundwater allocation if it needed to be done all the time. And then you work those until you've got sufficient development that you've got, let's say, 1.5 gigs of water, because when you've got 1.5 gigs of water, you can fund a treatment plant and a recharge bore to store that water seasonally, and then you'll get all of that water, because you'll miss quite a lot of it. Does that add up? Cheers. Cheers.
So our next speaker is Waterwise Cities, Testing and Developing Effective Messaging by Linda Tagni from Metrix Consulting. I didn't get a chance to ask Linda any questions related to things that we don't know about her, but she did have an interesting thing here in her biography, which I'll get to. So after a short stint in finance, Linda landed a role as a research analyst in market research. Almost 20 years later, she finds herself still in the industry and still loving what she does. She's been fortunate to meet and work with with many inspiring people and a fantastic list of clients. The industry has changed a lot in this time, and the business challenges clients face have become much more complex. It keeps work interesting. So away from work, Linda is interested in travelling, camping and cycling. And, I guess that's, and cycling, actually, that's the other thing I forgot to mention about Nick. He does a bit of cycling. I think there's a few people in the room. So I've got a question about cycling later on. But, really it comes down to people living in an environment and creating a livable environment. That's what we all want. So I look forward to Linda's talk about developing effective messaging. Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, and thank you very much to the Water Corporation and DEWA who've invited me to come and speak to you this afternoon. The focus of my presentation is quite different. It's not as technical as what we've heard about this morning, but it's looking at things from a community point of view. So there's obviously a lot happening in the water-sensitive cities space. Here we're referring to it as a Waterwise Perth city. And I guess it's understanding, you know, what are the messages that are going to resonate from a community point of view. You know, what's going to help raise awareness of Waterwise City as a concept and encourage people to actually value and care about water in their community. Now, we know that water literacy is important. It's a key step towards customers positively changing their behaviour in their water use, and it's also a step towards customers becoming advocates for water, and I guess ultimately that's the end goal. Research has shown that higher water literacy is correlated with greater uptake of water-sensitive behaviours. In 2020, so starting back in July of last year, Metrix, I guess, partly repeated a study that we had done in 2017, which was to look at the community attitudes and knowledge, understanding of what it means to be a Waterwise city here in Perth. Now, the state government has obviously recognised the importance of water literacy and water knowledge, having set targets to increase engagement and knowledge about water by 15% by 2030. In terms of where we're currently sitting, the Water Corporation measures this quite regularly, and we're currently sitting at about 62% in terms of where the community's at. So we've still got quite a way to go in getting people to where we want them to be. In terms of what I'll be talking to you about today, it was a two-stage approach. So firstly, we ran some focus groups with different, I guess, segments of the community, different life stages. And part of that was exploring their reactions to some key messages that had been developed by the Water Sensitive Transition Network here in Perth. We then quantified those attitudes, knowledge and understanding through an online survey. So what did we find? Okay, so 4 in 10 people here in Perth told us that they've heard of the term Waterwise City. So there's obviously a large proportion that still haven't heard about what a Waterwise City is. But interestingly, there still isn't a clear understanding of what this actually means. People talk a lot about a Waterwise City in the context of I guess what they're either doing or could be doing at a personal level to save water in and around the home. So they talk a lot about you know, using water-saving appliances, water-efficient shower heads, shower timers, etc. And look, this is no surprise, because obviously if we think about the messages that have been a focus of community education campaigns, particularly driven by the Water Corporation, that has obviously been a key focus. In terms of the next steps about what a Waterwise City is and what it could be here in Perth, you know, there's some understanding that there's water recycling, different water sources. I guess at the next level, some of the excellent examples that have already been talked about here today in terms of what business, industry, government are doing to actually implement some of the principles of a Waterwise City in the way that they operate and the projects that are being funded and implemented. However, this is, you know, at one very small end of the spectrum. There's clearly an opportunity for people to be better informed about what's happening. Overall, people feel that the concept of a Waterwise City and Perth being part of a Waterwise City, it's well received, it's aspirational. And a lot of this comes back to the fact that being a Waterwise City is so closely linked to the Perth lifestyle. Water is so important here in Perth and people can relate to that. So when informed, you know, they recognise the benefits of Perth working towards being a Waterwise City. At the moment, based on how we define a Waterwise City, about 4 in 10 people believe that we're already there, but there's obviously a large proportion who feel that we've still got a long way to go. If we look at some of the attitudes towards Perth becoming a Waterwise City, there's a strong expectation that government and industry play a significant role in this. So, you know, well over 80% of people agree that both business and government should play a significant role. And this is pretty much where it was sitting back in 2017. So still very strong expectations there, and therefore, you know, they are interested to hear what is actually happening in this space that either government, business or industry is investing in. What was good to see was some positive shifts in people's attitudes. So people saying that they recognise the benefits personally of living in a Waterwise city improved, and also people's, I guess, understanding and acknowledgement that they can actually play a role in Perth becoming a Waterwise city also improved. So for all of you out there, you know, trying to sell these messages and encourage people to, you know, taking up the behaviours that we want them to, you know, you're in a good place because people are willing to listen. They recognise that there's an opportunity for them in the role that they can play. In terms of their knowledge and understanding about specific water-related issues or topics, again, we did see some improvement in knowledge and understanding since we measured some of these back in 2017. The ones where we saw the biggest improvements were in relation to the health benefits of water. So, you know, this was measured in July, sort of post the peak of COVID here in WA. So not surprisingly, we saw that increase. We saw improvements in people's self-reported knowledge of how water contributes, of water conservation in the home and garden. Obviously, you know, a core focus of Water Corporation demand management campaigns between 2017 and 2020, that Nature Knows Best campaign was the core demand management campaign run by the corporation. And also an improvement in people's understanding that, you know, we do have a diverse range of water sources. Again, this has been a more recent focus of some of the messaging, particularly where we start to talk about climate change and the importance that we do have a diversity of water sources. So we saw some improvements there, but there is still room to improve the community's water literacy across a number of these other themes. So we see that the health, the lifestyle, the water conservation benefits are understood, but, you know, much lower levels of awareness and understanding of things like the water sources, the economic benefits of water, you know, the role of the urban water cycle. So these are all important Waterwise cities topics, you know, words and themes that we've heard in a lot of the presentations that we've heard this morning, but where knowledge is still relatively low. So there's definitely an opportunity there. I mentioned earlier that the first phase of the work that we did was looking at some reactions to some different messages that had been developed by the Water Sensitive Transition Network. These messages fit into 4 key focus areas or categories. The first one being water for healthy communities. So we heard a lot about that in our keynote presentation this morning. The environmental benefits of water, water for growth and sustainable water sources. So we'll talk about each of these in turn in a moment, but really the key takeout here was that, you know, these messages or these focus areas all have a role to play in improving people's understanding of what it means to be part of a Waterwise city. So, you know, people could resonate with, you know, various aspects of each of these focus areas. Okay, so if we look at each of these in turn, so water for healthy communities, as I said, we obviously heard quite a lot about this morning, but if we think about the sorts of messages that we could potentially be communicating with people about a healthy community, what people really liked about this as a focus area is that it can mean so many different things. It can mean healthy in terms of, you know, physical and mental health benefits, and from a community point of view, it can mean a person's local community, the broader Perth community, you know, WA as a bigger community again. So overall, people can see the importance of talking about water in the context of health and healthy communities. You know, we saw on the previous slide, though, that this is an area where people probably feel more informed. So there's still a role to play, and there's still probably pockets of information that people aren't aware of. But yeah, obviously we need that to work with our other focus areas as well. In terms of the environmental focus area, so clean environment and healthy ecosystems, what people like about this as a focus area is that, you know, water doesn't sit in isolation here. You know, when we can talk about water in the context of environment, it also relates to other aspects of our lives as well, be it recycling, reducing pollution, composting, etc. So these interrelationships were considered a positive of having this as a focus area. And some of the things that we looked at under this focus area were things like you know, stop polluting the groundwaters, rivers and wetlands with fertilisers and pesticides. And, you know, the use of threatening and words like threatening, loss of plant and animal species were really powerful. You know, it really reminded people of the real impacts of their behaviour. Probably the key takeout here, though, is that, you know, for the average person in the WA community, there can be some quite technical terms, you know, where we were talking about things like urban landscapes, algal blooms, often can require some clarification. So we need to think about that when we're trying to communicate these messages to the community. Our third focus area around water for growth. So again, they like the fact that growth could be used in a number of different contexts. So, you know, we can talk about population growth, industry growth, you know, even growth in terms of, you know, plants, horticulture, agriculture. So, you know, we can use a bit of a play on words here. In terms of the growth-related messages, what people particularly like here is to hear about some of the stats and statistics about, you know, what it means from the point of view of being a water-wise city. So, for example, when we started to introduce messages like by 2050 we're expected to have 70% more people than we have now, we need to ensure that we have the required water supply, people were really sitting up and listening because they could, I guess, relate to that, and it was a tangible outcome. So, you know, thinking back to some of the messages earlier this morning around, you know, setting targets and KPIs, like, or indicators, you know, it just demonstrates that where we do have some fun facts, some important facts to share, and if we can communicate them in a simple way, the community is willing to listen and we can get them engaged. And lastly, around sustainable water sources. So here, you know, people obviously connected this back to Perth's water sources for future generations. You know, they could see this going beyond, you know, their own backyard or their own sort of in-home behaviours, and extending to, you know, broader communities, open spaces, amenities, be it parks, sporting grounds, or, you know, even some of the, you know, the waterways that or drainage areas that we've talked about today, or that we've heard about today. Again, there were some messages that resonated quite well where we talked stats with people. So, you know, talking about around 70% of all our water use, or almost half of Perth's drinking water supplies. They're impactful and, you know, they grab people's attention. One of the things here, though, is, again, from an average punter point of view, let's just try and think about where there are technical terms, how we can simplify those. So if we're talking about things like the urban water cycle, groundwater, stormwater, which are not clearly understood by the average person, you know, potentially we can try and depict these more visually through images or infographics. So coming back to my initial question around, you know, what are the messages that will help raise awareness of Waterwise city concepts here in Perth and encourage people to value and care about water in their community? A lot of it really comes back to common sense, and also comes back to finding some balance in what it is that we're trying to communicate. So some of the key things are, one, obviously it's important to reinforce the role that water actually plays here in Perth. So, you know, our lifestyle is quite heavily connected to water, and this resonates really strongly in terms of the Waterwise city concept. Demonstrating the positive implications of a Waterwise Perth. So, you know, where we can give examples of how it can benefit people either personally or at a community level. As I've mentioned a couple of times, you know, using relevant facts and statistics, but balancing these with the words and the images that people can understand and that they can relate to in the messages that we're trying to get across. Fourthly, explaining both the why and the how that people can contribute to Perth becoming a Waterwise city. So, you know, we saw that there is an appetite or a, you know, a perceived opportunity there. So let's look at how we can engage people by giving them the why and the how. And clearly also demonstrating that both individuals and organisations have a role to play. So obviously there are some great case studies, projects that we could look to tell people about and get them engaged. In terms of how we communicate these messages, so, you know, obviously a lot of these themes can be quite technical, quite complex topics to convey. So let's try and keep the messaging, the wording short, sharp and succinct where possible. Support it with relevant imagery and imagery that extends beyond the Perth CBD. So, you know, we're talking the broader community. And I think one of the important things here, and this was some very clear feedback that we received from people, was, you know, not too many of the lush green lawns and the very green imagery of what Perth is, because, you know, potentially that could almost contradict what it is that we're trying to focus on. But, you know, demonstrate the natives, the unique biodiversity and the landscapes and what this means for Perth specifically. Where possible, you know, try and engage people by using a positive call to action, and, you know, try and support that again through infographics, imagery in particular to support those technical terms. Okay, so in summary then, you know, there is still quite a bit of work to be done to build awareness and understanding of what it means to be a Waterwise city here in Perth. The Waterwise Action Plan is obviously a core document that will drive, or that is driving a lot of the actions and initiatives under that. You know, we're in a good position in that people are willing to listen. So, you know, we saw an increase in their perceived personal relevance and responsibility and the role that they can play. But they do want to hear about a broad range of themes relating to water and what that means from a Waterwise city point of view. And where possible, trying to connect that back to other aspects of people's lives. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, finding the right balance in the content and the style of the communications. So demonstrating examples of how both individuals and organisations can and are already contributing to Perth being a Waterwise city. Potentially, you know, imagery that shows, you know, what it wouldn't be, you know, why we don't want to live in a city that isn't Waterwise, you know, versus what it looks like to actually live in a Waterwise city. And, yeah, the facts and statistics, which really speak for themselves. Now, I know that Water Corp, and I think to an extent DWER, you know, have already taken quite a bit of this feedback on board and are looking to implement that in their communications. So, yeah, so thanks for the opportunity, and we look forward to seeing how this continues to evolve moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was illuminating, I guess, in that people are informed and they're very interested in this space. And I think it's easy to forget that, you know, when you're working away and doing your day-to-day work, whether it be in research or application. And yeah, I guess their trust is in our hands to make it happen. So are there any questions for Kate?
Thanks very much, Linda. Just a quick question was around, we've heard a lot over the last couple of days the use of the term livability. So I just wanted to see about what your research has found around that term.
Yeah, so look, we didn't explore it in a great level of detail in this most recent piece of work that we did, but certainly back in 2017 there were mixed reactions to how people feel about the term livability. You know, I guess on the one hand, or I guess on the negative side of things, it can sometimes be misconstrued to suggest that we're sort of doing the bare minimum of what we need to do as opposed to aspiring for more. But yeah, look, the reaction was fairly mixed. I think probably the biggest take out is, if we're going to talk about livability, is to give some pretty tangible examples of what that means and what you know, what that looks like from a Waterwise city. I think just talking about livability per se could potentially confuse people.
Was there any big difference in the demographics in terms of the awareness and retention in age or different social strata?
No, look, surprisingly there weren't huge differences. I'd say that overall probably the older, let's say 55 pluses, were probably, or did probably feel a bit more informed. Whether they necessarily had the right information was probably more the issue, but yeah, for the most part it really didn't differ all that much. I think in terms of overall probably appetite and wanting to know more, certainly at sort of the younger age groups, feeling that, you know, they'd like to be empowered and want to know more about what they can do. Yeah, so that's probably the main differences that we saw.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. So we've got a bit of time. Are there any other questions for any of the other speakers? That oh, yep, Daniel, thanks.
Yeah, Dan Ferguson from Department of Water and Environmental Regulation. I had a question for either Josh or Mike about the 4 case studies all being in and around the People's Republic of Fremantle. Wondered if those lessons that you've learnt are transferable to the eastern suburbs, where I guess we've got a different environment and perhaps different demographics looking to buy houses.
Sure, great question. There is another contributing factor. It's probably no surprise, I live and work in Fremantle, so nothing like having projects that are a stone throw from where you live. But more seriously, it's more a reason of the project team, and in particular the development managers with that cluster. So my house aside, obviously, which was a personal project, WGV, East Village at Knutsford and 115 Hamilton Hill, all development WA projects have been led by Warren Phillips and Naomi Lawrence. So they are clearly, you know, heavily responsible for the innovation, the leadership, supported of course by a suite of people at Development WA and their broader innovation through demonstration agenda. But that really is probably the reason for that cluster around Fremantle. And sure, one of the main sort of bits of feedback we get is that, well, you know, that's a particular climate type, being so close to the coast with the sea breezes, you know, similar soils and access to groundwater. And how does that then transfer to more difficult regions, sort of more inland in the coastal plain, where obviously different soils, constrained aquifers and hotter microclimates too? All very valid questions. I guess what we've tried to do with the projects is firstly frame it and say, look, these are infill developments as well, as opposed to greenfields. So that's important. And let's not forget that the current state government agenda is to focus on nearly 50% infill. Unfortunately, we're not meeting those targets, but that should be a focus, and a better focus on infill means less pressure on expanding greenfields areas. So that's important, though, in a certain context. Beyond the technologies of the day, a big focus is actually around the mechanisms of how we get these ideas into the development. So again, it's things like planning processes, it's about mechanisms like design guidelines, the various incentives that have been tested for purchases or for the larger lot, sub-developers, if you like. So I guess to wrap up, everything's going to be region and local site specific. That's important to note, but I think it's the underlying processes and some of the mechanisms that are tested are equally as valid, and it's all about just how you frame that with each project.
I've got another one, Josh. Yeah, I guess you've been operating in this space for a while. White Gum Valley has been a bit of a demonstration and been visited by, I think, nearly every conference that's gone on in the last few years. What's the market sort of response to it in terms of, is there interest? So it was, I guess, it's a bit of a follow-on from Dan's in terms of the application and interest moving forward.
So are you talking about market interest in terms of buyers buying into the development, or from the broader private
industry, I guess,
development sector? Yeah. Look, the interest from the development sector has been enormous. You know, between Warren and Naomi and myself, we were pretty much giving weekly tours at WGV over several years, not just to government but also to private developers. In many cases, we had repeat offenders, so the same development companies coming back a second and a third time as part of their purposely organised tours to bring new staff, and in particular senior development managers, to come and see what was happening. Keeping in mind that there's so much to see at a project like WGV, where it's not just about the water sensitive outcomes, it's around a very different way of developing infill development. So the mixed typology, the consideration around tree canopy retention, about that blurring interface between private and public realm. So that's generated just as much interest, I think, as some of the water innovations, and certainly the energy innovations around setting a net zero energy target, around having the building scale shared battery trial in 3 of the apartment sites there. So there's so many layers to it that I think it's really attracted broad interest. And I guess I'll finish up on that in saying that that's why I think it's so important when we're out there pitching the water sensitive or Waterwise as the new term here in WA. It's so important to put that in a context of broader good quality urban design and development. And when we do that, the projects become much richer. I think the audience becomes much wider and more receptive, and then the end product is so much better as well. And that's when you start getting great response from sales, and I think it's also where we need to be pitching our vision in terms of a future Perth and Peel.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks to all the speakers. As Josh was speaking there again, he reminded me of his reference to having a trajectory of projects. And when he was sort of mentioning that, I was sort of thinking, and Mike was talking about knowledge transfer and adoption. So really, it's the trajectory of projects, and then having that sort of explode like a firework and across the region and getting it adopted, not only in terms of the best practices that have been displayed by that project, but the best practice and work that's been displayed by the other projects. So we heard about from Kate about the performance of constructed wetlands, and that they are working and they do deliver results. We didn't hear so much about the other benefits that they provide in terms of the non-market benefits, but many of us, I'm sure, wander around and meditate and have yoga sessions in these sort of environments. So, which then link back, to a reference that Linda had in her talk about that 48% of people want design of public spaces to clean and filter water. So people have an expectation that these things are going to happen, and I think there's probably a bit of concern that maybe it isn't going to happen. I mean, we're not far off 3.5 million people in Perth. The plan for Perth Peel at 3.8 million, sorry, Perth Peel at 3.5 million came out at 2018, and that was for year 2030. So we're already 3 years in, and I guess the question is, in terms of those sorts of precinct designs, we've got 150 of those types of precincts, or bigger precincts, within, in terms of corridors and railway precincts and that sort of thing. And the design and planning is happening for those places now. So, I guess there is a concern that work, which is showing results, needs to start getting integrated now, and that's all from, you know, from that scale down to Carolyn was talking about green walls. I mean, I think everyone it's become part of the vernacular now. Where's the green wall? Why aren't there more green walls around the place? And Carolyn's research in terms of adapting that to local conditions is going to be quite critical. And Mark and Nick alluded to the complexities and issues that we're dealing with. They pretty well indicated that there's quite a few options around, but they're not cheap. Nick provided the example of South Australia in terms of what they've managed to achieve. Again, with a big pot of money. I was going to ask Nick, if you had 100 million over here, what would you do with it? But then I realised I'd be in between Nick and the pot of money, so it wouldn't be a safe space. But riding here this morning, I rode my bike this morning, and I was riding along the bicycle way, and there's been huge investment in bicycle ways and other infrastructure, and yet when it comes to water infrastructure and greening infrastructure, these questions are raised as to, you know, making it pay. Yeah, certainly there has to be that, but it's not everything, I think. So thank you again, if you put your hands together for the speakers, and look forward to so lunch is now, and we come back at what time?
Hi everybody. All right, so although we have progressed, definitely, because there's a whole lot of things that we've been focusing on to deliver better urban elements functioning as part of the urban water system. We've gathered information on the cost benefits. We actually have principles of components of the degrees. We've spoken about that. We need our young graduates to understand what we're talking about. We have been working with all the industry associations. So I think maybe that's a part of it. We've been maybe working with them individually because it's really hard to connect industry associations together. So maybe that's the next thing. We have recognised that we've got some exemplar projects, but they're not mainstreamed yet. We are providing input into those policy elements, which is great, but not to the extent that they've resulted in some published indicators or targets. So again, the actions that we identified but we haven't progressed with are the measurement of performance. So that actual on ground, how well does a biofilter work in Perth? We're still getting people saying, oh, they don't work, because they haven't necessarily been measured here. Although some of the work that was presented this morning by Kate is definitely showing that they work. So we just need to share some more of that information. What else have we got? I think that's site and development context. So if you were in the session yesterday, now our policy instruments are starting to recognise that, yes, we're used to working on sandy soils and we had some really good solutions, but they don't work everywhere. So the need for our solutions to be relevant to the site context, what's going to work on clays, what's going to work on slope, what's in sand, and recognising that those are going to be different solutions, I think we haven't progressed far enough with that. The other thing, allocation of groundwater and alternative non-potable water. So we heard some awesome presentations this morning from Nick and Mark, and we've got Susan in the room, so and Dan. So we're going to solve this one. Just keep going, guys. So that moves us forward to what do we need to move? What actions do we need to try and identify that are going to change the practices to deliver urban elements functioning as part of the urban water sectors? So our focus is on building broad support and developing a collective voice, and also a little bit of better guidance and policy, and I think that might be reflected in the targets idea. And then we go through to building organisational champions and increasing knowledge of solutions across industry. So if you're in the urban elements functioning as part of the urban water sector group, then remember that these are the sorts of actions that we'd probably like to see. So the third area that we need to focus on is community capital. And although we've done a pretty good job, I don't think we're far enough there. So there's a hell of a lot less green in this one than there was in the previous one, although we have progressed. So what we have done is we've developed a number of simple messages targeting the public to increase their water awareness. They haven't necessarily been used by all organisations at the moment, but we will progress with that. So the things that we haven't done is the social research on understanding why people don't value water or don't connect with it or don't like a biofilter or they get annoyed at a swale or those sorts of things. We don't necessarily have that knowledge, that research yet. And we also haven't necessarily got the full review, although we did it 4 or 5 years ago. We just haven't progressed that now to make sure that all of the agencies are using common messaging. So what do we need to do to change practices to increase community capital? The focus is on understanding why community water literacy is generally low, and again, developing a collective voice for connecting champions. And then, oh, I got those around the wrong way, sorry. And then trialling projects to increase community capital. So if you're in the community group, then that's what we want you to do. So given that, we have 40 minutes. So what we'd probably like to do is break up into 3 groups and have 20 minutes to go through and identify some strategies and actions that are going to address one of those elements. So we can have some groups. We'll have one group around here. I've got some butcher's paper and I'm thinking we can stick some butcher's paper up there, and then someone can facilitate and scribe. Okay, everybody, this is goal 5, improve ecological health. Emma Monk.
All right, this is a very complicated topic, as I'm sure you all know, and it took us a while to even understand as a group what the heck we were talking about and trying to achieve. And then that actually identified the biggest problem, which is that we need to actually develop a case for why we need to protect ecological health and what we then need to do to deliver improved ecological health. So the first step is delivering at first we said business case, but that sounded very financial. So we actually mean just a case, and that addresses environmental, social, financial aspects. And to do this is how we'll get our connected champions, which is our first step that we have to do in the TDF. That would be working collaboratively with the various stakeholders in government and industry who are already the individual champions to develop this business case. And then through that, we will define the indicators and outcomes of success.
Can I just suggest that it might not be a business case, but more that narrative? So it's
it's just a case is what the word.
The why and the what.
Yeah. And then from that, that's where then the agreed targets come in on the what the outcomes we want to achieve, such as protecting and retaining, restoring ecosystems, and water quality targets, water quantity targets. But the first thing we need to do is actually just build a team of people who build that narrative of why we need to actually improve ecological health. And then from that, we would hope that we have some unified approach. So it isn't just coming down to individuals using existing mechanisms. We have existing policies, guidelines that say the right things, but it comes down to individuals in a local government or in a state government or even in consultancies saying, well, look, the guideline says this, so we should therefore do this. But if it's not understood higher up, that gets overridden, and we don't get the things on the ground that lead to improved ecological health. So we didn't get any further than that because that was already a big thing to try to capture.
Does anybody in the group have anything else to add? No? Cool. All right, fantastic work, group. All right, so the next one we're going to go to is urban elements functioning as part of the urban water system. So this was really about getting that green and blue infrastructure into our urban form, multifunctional spaces, buildings, built form, urban form.
I think what Emma just said was probably pretty much the same for us, really, because I'll start over this side. We know there is a lot of guidance and policy already, but there seems to be sort of a lack of will for whatever sometimes to implement it. So we think we need more of a mandate, and whether that comes from the top politically or through our individual agencies, and perhaps through the Waterwise steering committee, should it be beefed up in some way. But we also thought that there needs to be separate guidance for infill and greenfield projects, and even drilling down further, it probably needs to be site specific, depending on what the circumstances are and where you are in the Swan coastal plain, whether you're in the high groundwater areas or you're in the free draining sands. And I guess an example that we already have now is with the Waterwise development guidelines that have been done for 115, which are really a great template for anyone working in the deep sands of the coastal plain. We also talked about government leadership projects and how that they are an opportunity to demonstrate some of this stuff, but then how do you get over the sort of cost hurdle? How do we incentivize that? And we also talked about expanding on existing programs that are working really well, like the drainage for livability, and that kind of where we hopped over to the other side about building support and a collective voice, was perhaps seeing how that program could be rolled out for private developers who are doing work in proximity to drainage assets, even if they're not on their site, as a way of giving back in a water sensitive city context. So we also talked about how to promote the multiple benefits more broadly amongst all the key stakeholders, including the industry participants that we want to draw in. And then by extension, we sort of talked about the importance of cross collaboration, including research, and then the importance of trying to get cross collaboration with universities, local government authorities and industry. And lastly, probably the importance that maybe we haven't tapped into are regional councils, who tend to be better resourced than individual councils, and probably have a little bit more sway. If you can get a regional council to adopt something as a policy, then you might get 5 or 6 member councils also following suit. So I don't know, does anyone have anything else to add?
Is anybody else? Yep, John. Let's move on to the final one. Just letting you know that we do have one more session before drinks, and the drinks are really cool. So even if you can't stay for dinner, please stay and have a drink after the leadership panel, which is going to start at 4. But we'll just go to our final group, which is on community capital.
Yeah, great. I think the first thing we realised is there's actually a lot of resources in this space. So in terms of understanding why community capital is low, or understanding community values, we talked about more of a review of the info we've got, so things like the Metrix research, the tap-in, which was a massive community engagement program, the Waterwise public housing project, which includes an education component, Waterwise schools, and they've got fabulous new resources. We've got a water literacy measure that's been running, Water Corp's been running for the last couple of years. Work done by local government, eco-education centres and so on, and also by NRM groups. And friends of and catchments groups. So it's sort of tapping into, the knowledge that we've got and the local resources as well. Things like community gardens, community composting sites, all that. And the home study as well. A large residential water use study that's providing a lot of information about behaviours. So gleaning that info. The sorts of issues that we talked about was that it's a bit of a complicated message. If you're giving people specific details of how they should irrigate their garden, how much and when and so on. Water's not seen as a critical issue. It's not top of mind. It's still not understood as a limited resource. We've avoided a crisis and a lot of our messaging about climate proofing and so on. So we haven't, and a lot of water, like if you think about groundwater and water infrastructure, a lot of it's below ground, so it's out of sight, out of mind. People can be a bit detached from water. Lifestyle expectations, we've still got people who want, expect green lush lawns, and there's a sense of entitlement to water and this never-ending resource. Still got a lack of understanding around sources, particularly around the cost and energy use of desalination, and the idea that, well, look out to the ocean, we've got endless supply of water. So the desal can give us that sort of sense. And a lack of connection and understanding of the cultural values associated with water and those health values as well. So it's trying to build that up. And there's a lack of pathways for people to get involved. So people, like the Metrix survey showed that people do want to take some responsibility and get involved, but what are those pathways for them to actually get involved in water management? We've got to provide those opportunities. Yeah, so that lack of access to really simple information that people can relate to. So the actions that we discussed were, we thought the actions that were in the last version of the implementation plan were still relevant. So that research around, or more literature review and gap analysis around community values, better understanding why community capital is low, evaluating existing programs, what's been effective, what hasn't and why. Method to get people involved is turning off the tap. That'll so water restrictions will sort of make people pay attention. That was just something there too. And engagement pathways. There is a lot of social, friends of group or community gardens, connecting with those to bring in some of the Waterwise messaging. We talked about a 48-hour water famine event. And we still thought the action around getting that common messaging in existing programs was important, and increasing collaboration networks between those existing programs and champions. So bringing those people together, improving the connections between those programs and embedding the messages in there as well. So that's where we got to.
Great. Does anybody else from the group have anything to add?
Oh, I forgot. And it, in the Waterwise Perth Action Plan, the great thing is Action 7 is already looking at quite a number of those. So sort of being able to, work with the Waterwise Perth Action Plan.
Right. Anyone from the group? Everybody's brain dead. Okay. That's okay, because thank you everybody for undertaking that exercise. I recognise that the TDF Transition Dynamics Framework is a bit complex, but the science behind it is actually really cool, and it really does show us where we have to focus on these practice changes to get stuff happening. So it can be a very effective tool. And I think we've done really well in the last 5 years as well. So that spot on, okay, 3 minutes over, which is not too bad. So that, I think so, Son, thank you, brings to a close our workshop session. We have another session starting at 4 o'clock, which is the WA Leaders Panel. Mike Mouritz is going to be our fantastic MC for that. And we have 4 or 5, Mike? 4 fantastic speakers who are going to come up here on the stage and share stories about how they are water leaders and how they can help other people either learn to be water leaders or grow and deliver this fantastic water sensitive city stuff that we've been talking about for the last 2 days. Sonia has something to say.
It's really important. Even if you're not staying for dinner, I understand, but please stay for drinks. So it's pre-dinner drinks for those for staying for dinner, or post-conference drinks for those that have other commitments.
Because you have to drink all the alcohol, because otherwise it goes back to Crown. It is like a 21st. And let's get a bag, hide it in your bag. So again, thanks to everybody for joining in that session, and let's see what happens for the next action plan. So we'll see you back here at 4 o'clock.
So thank you everyone for hanging about for this session. And when we were planning it, it started, please take a seat, guys, please take a seat. Move along, I'm going to join you sitting down. When we planned this session, it started with the notion of, who are the leaders in the area, and we realised that that's a really big challenge because everyone in this space is a leader in some way, shape or form. And then we changed the focus a little bit to the notion of leadership and what it takes to get things to happen. So we brought together a panel with representatives from the regulator, from the utility, from local government and the development sector to really, share the learnings in that context. So I'd like to introduce you to Stuart Reside, who I've only just met, who is the General Manager of Urban Quarter. It's a developer that's got lots of good track record in this space. and Susan Brown, I'll get the Suzanne and the Suzanne, who all of you know and has had many, many years working with Watercorp and in other aspects, and is a muso as well. We're in the theme of musos from Watercorp. And her role these days is as manager of the drainage and livability communities part of Water Corporation that's helping that great restoration of the waterways that's happening around the Perth metro area and beyond. And Susan Worley, who most of you probably know as well from the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation, and Giles Pickard from the City of Canning. Unfortunately, Tony Brun got his instructions a bit messed up and he hasn't been able to make it this afternoon. So congratulations, Giles, on representing local government this afternoon. So, well, yeah, we concur with that. We concur. And I guess what I want to do, just by way of context and introduction, was just say that my journey in this space has been around about 30 odd years. And as I mentioned before, I brought along a little bits of ancient history to prove that. The very first document published in February 1990, the first conference proceeding from 91, and the first set of guidelines that were produced in 1994. And my first little experience with the leadership part of those things in that context was the three main agencies involved, which were EPA at the time, Water Authority, and the Department of Planning and Urban Development at the time, funded a process to prepare those guidelines. And then they got stuck in the system. No one wanted to release them because it was all a bit scary, like it sometimes happens in agency processes. And the team that had actually been working on the work just couldn't believe it, and there was a lot of other people that knew the space. And so we organised a conference through the Institution of Engineers at the time and asked the Minister to release the guidelines. And somehow or other they miraculously appeared out of thin air and got into the public realm, because all it was doing was releasing them for public comment. So it wasn't really a risky thing to do. But, you know, sometimes in these processes you have to push people's buttons to get things to move. So I guess the main driver when all of that started back then isn't completely different than where we are now. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, the driver was the impact of urban development on groundwater, on wetlands and on the river. And I think the thing that's changed significantly in that 30 odd years is the increasing recognition about drying climate. And so that's the big overlay. And obviously continuing to grow and the expectation of getting to 3.5 million in whatever date that turns up. You know, previously it had been talking about it being, you know, 2035 or whatever. You know, that changes with the circumstances. And I guess what we wanted to do today with the suite of people that have had their own leadership journey was explore a little bit about what it might be like to have achieved a water sensitive city by 2030 or got a lot further down the path. This morning, particularly in Ben Famage's talk, he asserted, which I think is pretty fair to say, that all of the work of the water sensitive CRC has done a great job of proof of concept, and there's a range of good projects on the ground as well. So the real challenge becomes, and you know, of the Water Sensitive Institute moving forward and those involved in that process, is really around how do we get to the mainstreaming. So that's the proposition. So my question to the panel members, as they introduce their role in this space, is around what are the key leadership challenges for us individually and collectively as we move forward to 2030 in the context of trying to mainstream and really lock in the learnings that we've had from this journey. So happy to start wherever in terms of the journey that a little bit about your journey around the water sensitive space and what you think is key for moving forward over the next decade.
Well, thanks, Mike. As you sort of mentioned, my name's Stuart Reside. I've been involved in the development industry for almost 20 years. And I suppose my journey is one from a project management, private sector perspective. And I suppose very much, as I see it, a facilitator in this space. You pick up a lot along the way in terms of some technical knowledge, but you know, you're a jack of all trades and a master of none in my role, and this space is an example of that. But nevertheless, I think so long as you, as a leader and as a facilitator from the private sector, if you know, in my role, we can create a sense of sort of a cultural sense where this is important in what we do and it's valued, then it will happen. Then it'll happen more because it gets the traction at sort of someone in my role where you're bringing together consultants in the various fields to make things happen and to get improved outcomes. Because sometimes the path of least resistance can be attractive, you know, and you don't get good outcomes necessarily, but you need to put in the work and, as I said, have that sort of have that energy and value the outcomes that we're looking for here. So my view is that from a leadership point of view, we just need to keep celebrating water, the importance of water in our culture and our society, the benefits of it in terms of our ecology, and yeah, those things matter. And you know, starting at education, starting at primary schools, starting with the young ones as they come up and move through the system, and they hold those same values, then we'll get things continuing to happen.
Thank you. And Suzanne, your perspective, which is substantial in the area.
So I began my my water corporation career in 1996. So that's 25 years now in the water corp. So you know they let people in when they were 12. You know, obviously. And when I joined, we were in WA really starting to just experience that severe impacts of climate change in the southwest of WA. So in a way that the East Coast and South Australia as well hadn't yet experienced. So from a utility perspective, I think the water corporation's held as an example of diversifying sources and diversifying options for sources. The Water Services Association of Australia has just released its All Options on the Table report, which talks about not just the Water Corporation of WA's journey, but all utilities and what we do need to do to keep all the options on the table. 10 years ago, we were building our second desalination plant, the Southern Seawater plant down at Biddingup. And in that period as well, we had 1 year where we had more evaporation from our surface water sources than we had runoff into those sources. So, you know, the change in what we've seen in the water utility sector has just been immense. In 1996, when I joined, we were still planning and about to build the next dam. So we built the Harvey Dam. So it was an existing reservoir. We built a new dam next to it to expand on that. We're not going to be building new dams into the future. We also, in this last 10-year period, have planned and built the groundwater replenishment first trial and then full-scale plant. Nick Turner, who's not here anymore, was, you know, the champion of driving that process, and the leadership thrown through that journey was the recognition that this was not a technological or an engineering challenge, but a social acceptance challenge and a regulator acceptance challenge. Without the regulatory framework available to regulate the health impacts, for example, that project wouldn't have got off the ground. So bringing the health regulator along the journey, as well as the community, and gaining community acceptance of drinking treated wastewater, and being very mindful of the Toowoomba experience, where just going out to them with a popularity contest and having all the extremes come out of the woodwork and say how bad this was. You know, Nick Turner and his team did an amazing job of taking that from a concept into full-scale production, and coming around full circle to the changing role of the engineer in the utility as a public health protector. I think more recently as well, the changing role of drainage and the appreciation of the drainage assets. So this is a bit closer to home from my perspective. The work we did 5 years ago in recognising that we had a shared vision with our colleagues at Department of Water and Environment Regulation. So, and credit to Tim Sparks and his team, and then Jason, who was on the team at the time and now I've recruited into my team. Recognising that we had way more in common than we had difference is a massive step forward in leading change. So when we're trying to gain change, look for the consensus, look for what we can agree on rather than squabbling about what we don't agree on. And out of that was born the Drainage for Livability program, which has led to such amazing on-the-ground changes, including in our City of Canning projects, which I'll let Giles talk about when he gets to him. So we have seen enormous change, and it has taken, you know, some pretty brave and bold leadership. I think Ben, in his keynote this morning, one of the things I wrote down, he said, was be bold. So it does take a bit of boldness. Billy also said, this is not a dress rehearsal. You know, we just have to get on and do it. I can remember Sue Murphy standing up in front of a group of senior leaders about 10 years ago at Watercorp and looking at us all and going, if you're waiting for a better looking and more charismatic bunch of people to come along and save us, you know, you're going to be waiting a long time. It's you. It's all of you. So, you know, we've still got a lot of challenges. I guess we can come to challenges in the next round. I'll let Giles have a chat now.
Thanks, Suzanne. And yeah, speaking at short notice can certainly be its own challenge. But certainly appreciate being up here, and it's just been a fantastic journey that the CRC has allowed us all to go on. And for me to take on some leadership in terms of being the Deputy Chair of the Water Sensitive Transition Network. And I think that's come about, and to, coming from Suzanne's comment, of being bold, being active in a lot of workshops and other groups in this space. And just through that, through going to a lot of these conferences and talks and speaking my mind and being very active, has given me some really great opportunities to be involved and to step up and to lead and to be parts of groups where I look around and go, wow, there's a lot of senior people in this room. What am I doing here? But then going, no, actually, I've got some good opinions and I'm going to speak those, and they're heard and they're listened to. So yeah, it's been a great journey. For me in local government, one of the things that has really stuck with me over the years and inspired me to be in local government was an experience studying. I studied landscape architecture in Melbourne, originally from WA, but had moved to Melbourne, and was absolutely incredibly lucky when living in Melbourne to have a mentor who, thankfully, I didn't actually know who he was when he became my mentor. He was just Rob, who taught me to draw, and he was an architect. And then it was when one of my lecturers' jaw dropped to the floor when he said, "You had breakfast with Rob Adams from City of Melbourne?" I'm like, "Yeah, Rob, we go to his house all the time." He's just through a connection we had. And Rob is one of those influential city leaders. And through him, he really instilled in me that the power of local government to lift the bar, to lead by example, and to demonstrate to others, and to then share that demonstration and just keep lifting the bar in what you deliver. And he's absolutely been instrumental in that at the City of Melbourne. So he was certainly someone that inspired me to be in local government and also do your best and share and be active in that space. Yeah, so it was that experience, but also then as a student, living in Melbourne during the Millennium Drought, when water was just, everyone was talking about water. Be with my neighbours going, how are they keeping their lawn green down the road? Oh, they're illegally watering at 2 in the morning. And then I come back to Perth and everything was this lush green. So for me, that was a real learning and just eye-opening point of how different it was, but also studying landscape architecture and studying city making and planning and all those elements, seeing the need for water-sensitive urban design. So then being able to put that into practice when working at City of Fremantle, and then the opportunities that came when I worked at City of Subiaco through the CRC, and have to certainly thank Ant, who both put me on the spot today, but has also been instrumental in, I remember that first sit down we had for a chat, which was what was to become the Water Sensitive Transition Network, and that fantastic series of workshops that we had that brought together all these amazing people. And it's just amazing to see that legacy now continue on after the CRC, and to see that community of practice and that enabling environment. Now, I'm terrible for, I can keep talking and talking, I'm not sure how long I should go on for, but it's fantastic to see now an enabling environment that some of our leaders, such as Mike, have created with some of those documents. I know there's a document on my manager's shelf that he'll pull out occasionally that was co-authored by my manager and Mike 20 years ago about creating living streams in the city of Canning. And it's just fantastic to see we're now hitting the ground and we have these enabling environments and these networks that can allow that to happen, and just by being active and people speaking up.
Please, Susan.
Thank you, Giles.
looking back over the last 10 years or so at the biggest challenges, and the challenge is climate change for Perth. It's just a total challenge that underpins everything else. But when you think about your achievements in that time, to continue a theme, you remember those signs that were at Dumas House that said bore water used here? I got rid of them. That's my biggest achievement, because to me, it's my biggest small achievement, because that's just so symbolic of that mentality of, oh, it's just groundwater, it's second class, it doesn't matter, we can use that. But I like that there's one of the earliest CRC projects, D5 or something, that the Geoffrey London and Daniel J. Martin from Dan Martin from UWA. And I love that line that he has in that about thinking about Perth's second coast, about the groundwater across under Perth being a second coast for Perth that we're on top of all the time, but we can't really see it. And that's why we get to have the greenery. But that delicate balance of keeping the level up enough to hold up our wetlands and our greenery and trees, using it enough to provide water for public open space and amenity and public water supply, and the impact of climate on that is just such a massive challenge. So in the last 10 years, groundwater reached its lowest levels ever in Perth in 2015-16 after several dry years in a row. Dams, I know you say you'll never build another dam, but dams can be quite good at holding water in the landscape, actually, but not necessarily. And they're quite good for holding desal. So thank goodness for that. So I suppose one of the most important things, I think, is this message about groundwater you can take from it, but it's not just a great big storage tank under the ground. You know, it's holding up ecosystems, it's providing environments, it's holding up bushland. And so turning that around from being the lowest, because in 2009 when we did the Gnangara Groundwater Allocation Plan, our agenda, our goal was, this sounds sort of a humble goal, we wanted to slow the rate of decline. We didn't want to give up on groundwater, we just wanted to slow the rate of decline. And you beauty, we've slowed it, we've stopped it declining. In some areas there's a tiny little bit of recovery. It's still way lower than it should be, but it does show that interventions can make a difference, and multiple interventions, reducing total groundwater use, capping, land use change, pines, all of those sorts of things. If you bring them all together in a fairly joined up way, then you can make a difference. And if we've got sustainable groundwater into the future, we can keep a lot of our amenity and a lot of our water supply into the future. But that next layer of integrated, joined up interventions, I think comes from the sort of things that Mark and Nick talked to us about this morning, that, you know, actually designing the solutions for the future at quite a grand scale with the appropriate site-specific scale, but some of the biggest scale, where is it okay to do wastewater recycling for agriculture or for public open space? You know, having a bit of a master plan about being able to see where it's worth putting an effort in and where it's not so much worth putting in an effort in. So the other thing, just to finish, I think one of the most important things that's happened over the last several years is I certainly really appreciate the sense of collaboration across the water portfolio, specifically with the Water Corporation and the department. It's not just drainage for livability, it is in water supply planning and a whole suite of other areas. It actually means there's no argy-bargy, you're just getting on trying to solve the big problems that Sue Murphy put to you. And the other people I'd really like to compliment for their can-do attitude are pretty much the turf industry, you know, the local government people who do the public open space, who are outside all the time. They know they're not getting as much rain, so they're on the front foot with their design of parks, with their design of irrigation, banging on the door to get a bit of capital budget so they can retrofit their irrigation schemes. I never saw such a positive uptake of, let's just get this done, let's just get it sorted out. So I think that just seeing people at every level who can get on with stuff and just, you know, start to adjust to the future, it's fantastic.
Thank you for a first round. I just wonder whether or not, in the context of 2030 and a declining rainfall, is there Is it possible for any of you to make a comment about what might be a not negotiable as we move forward to 2030 and, you know, maybe a 10, 15% less rainfall context or whatever the projections might be? Is there some not negotiables that we need to try to lock in from a policy point of view? And it might be physical not negotiables, it might be community not negotiables. Certainly Billy Charles Cordy, sort of the keynote this morning was all about, you know, how do we make our cities more livable? And that seems to be a, whatever that means, are not negotiable. We're trying to have a better place to live. So it's those sort of broad things. And I'm sure, Suzanne, you'll talk about the groundwater thing you were just talking about. But and then we'll open up to questions from the floor. Any key not negotiables?
The current federal government and state government policy settings on climate change are screwed. All evidence points to, if we want to keep to a 1.5 degree average temperature rise, we need 0 by 2035. So 0 by 2050 is too late, and we can't wait till 2035 to realise that. So that's a personal view. Not sure my water corporation boss is comfortable with that, but it's too late. And so, yeah, that for me, that's a non-negotiable. Get on to climate change. That affects water availability and urban heat. There was a recent article in the ABC that showed that there's one city in the whole of Australia that's increased its vegetation canopy since 2013, despite all the good actions and good deeds done by local governments. So in the last 8 years, only one city has increased urban canopy, vegetation canopy, Hobart, and it's increased it by 1%. So if we're talking about urban heat management and the health impacts and the livability impacts, we need to do more with our climate change settings.
I'd like to second that. And also, yeah, I guess it is somewhat controversial in Western Australia, but it shouldn't be. But so one of those non-negotiables I see in the urban context is our tree canopy. The continual lot clearance and loss of trees without any offsets in place. So I understand in some developments we can't work around them, but we need to do more to work around trees and also integrate trees and vegetation into our urban fabrics. And for those reasons of climate change, urban heat, I'm working in that space for many years, probably more than half the people in the room, but for the other half that hadn't heard me bang on about it for years, going, oh, guess how hot I measured the surface. Go on, and I'd ask people to guess, and they'd go, oh, what, 60 degrees, 70 degrees? And when I measured the rubber softfall in full sun, and it was 98.4 degrees Celsius. And I was there going, I'm going to get to 100, but what's that smell? Oh, it's my shoes melting into the rubber. Just trees are just absolutely, and vegetation and gardens. I know it's biased, but it is why I'm a landscape architect. But it is one of those things that I do see as non-negotiables in every scenario we heard today in regards to the planning. We're hearing about more green, we're hearing about heat, we're hearing about health, mitigation, and I love the point that Nigel included in his slide as well, delight as well as something, and for me it's also about creating beauty, but creating those points where a bird can come up and rest and sing and brighten someone's day, and that piece of green infrastructure, while I don't necessarily love that term, will also act as stormwater mitigation for that extreme rainfall event. We've all, well, I'd say most of us have walked along a street and pulled the branch as it's laden with water and the person behind you's gotten soaked. I know that was some great memories of walking to school, but then speaking to engineers about that flood mitigation capacity of those branches to hold that water. So I think that's something that, yeah, I could just fill the whole end of our session talking about the importance of trees and canopy, but that's certainly something that we're very much lacking here in WA.
Stuart, from a developer perspective, what's a not negotiable for 2030?
Yeah, look, I think certainly from my experience, I guess it's alignment through the key stakeholders. You know, I hope this doesn't sound sort of cynical, but you know, in my experience, certainly early on, which is probably 5 to 10 years ago, you know, a lot of things seem to come down to sort of risk and maintenance. on the ground, and that can be extremely frustrating. Yeah, I think it's as a facilitator, putting together the private sector that unless something is government funded, then it's privately funded, and it needs to be a reason to do something. And putting the consultants together and putting the local government together and the Water Corp and the Department of Environment and the local government, it would be great. And look, it's gotten a lot better. There's no question about that. And you referred to it earlier in terms of the drainage strategy and the alignment there with the conversion of main drains with Water Corp and local governments. Initially that was actually really difficult because I was involved in the Nearigan Brook conversion, Nearigan Brook North, and we came up against all sorts of barriers and all sorts of reasons to say no, we don't want to integrate public open space and a drain, and it's too risky, and it's who's going to look after it. And I was like, oh my God, why is this so hard?
I have heard this before.
Yeah, and as a sort of somewhat, public project manager trying to do a good thing and get something sorted out, it can be incredibly frustrating, and we're therefore deferred to perhaps more simple things. But anyway, we didn't, and we got there, and we got a great outcome in that particular neck of the woods. So yeah, I would sort of say that I think it's important and to have a non-negotiable to be in alignment amongst the key policymakers.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything?
No, I do, because I've already talked about groundwater sustainability being non-negotiable, because otherwise we'd lose everything. But I do want to pick up on this point about maintenance, because that was one of the themes I wanted to come back to. I think understanding that maintenance is a non-negotiable is really, really fundamental. Kate spoke about it this morning with the constructed drainage, that you actually have to look after stuff. You don't just build shiny stuff and hand the keys over to the local government and walk away. You've got to look after stuff. And I think maintenance is a theme too. You talked about it this morning when you talked about learning and just picking up, and that's another way I see maintenance. You pick up what you've learned, you build, you grow. And when Ian wrapped up this morning's session, he talked about, just keep going, keep the trajectory going, and it explodes. I think we do have to keep going. I think turning a blind eye is not accepted. Tim sometimes asked to turn a blind eye to things, and if he did, no, seriously, if he did, then you're just stuffed. You just continue with going down the wrong trajectory. You have to maintain the right trajectory, keep going in the right direction, and that's really important for all of us and for everyone we can influence.
I'd just like to open up to the floor. Any questions of our panel to just get a bit of a discussion around, what do we need to try and focus on over the next 8 or 9 years to get to 2030, please.
Just a question around quick pays. I've heard a few of the speakers talk about Waterwise costs more. I think yourself, Mike, you said that we invested the cost of a few lots from the industry itself as we were building. We heard Nick say that everyone agrees that it should be someone else who pays for Waterwise. And when you look at other states of Australia, like Melbourne, for instance, where there's a drainage levy which does go back into the urban water sector. And we heard about the Commonwealth investment into water, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin. I just wonder if there's a structure that we could be looking at to invest more money into Waterwise, and where's that going to come from?
Yeah, I can certainly speak from a local government perspective. I know when you get that water bill and you've got that drainage levy contribution that you pay, we would love for a percentage of that to come to the local government in which it's raised for water sensitive infrastructure within there. Now, I understand that we're all in the state of Western Australia, and we've got to cover a massive, and Water Corp do an absolutely fantastic job in terms of providing, and honestly, like when you think of the scale of the system that they manage, but that is subsidised through many of the urban customers, and while I certainly wouldn't say all that money should come back, but it would be great if some of that money were able to be utilised to drive that change that we need. Because I think if we just said that money needs to go back to the local government, and then you'd get more pits and pipes everywhere, and we don't want more of that. So could some of that money come back to be an enabler? Yeah, certainly that would be a local government, and probably I should say personal view of that, but keen to hear what the Water Corp has to say.
So I'm not authorised or qualified to speak on economic matters, but in a general sense, how society pays for anything is a conscious policy decision. Right? So, for example, you know we have tens of thousands of homeless people. We could fund that by diverting money from something else, restructuring the taxation system, for example, getting rid of franking credits. You know, like, I don't know anything about finance, but it's a conscious decision that government makes about what it decides to fund and what it doesn't decide to fund, or whether it decides to ask the private sector, who arguably could benefit from higher land development sales, you know, higher property values. So it's a complicated question, because you know, you could argue that who benefits from those kinds of decisions should pay, or at least contribute. So how you distribute that contribution is again a policy decision, and that's a conscious policy decision that governments make.
I might have a bit of, I've got a speaker here, I don't need one, but pass that along. I mean, a few years ago we actually did a proposition paper that we tried to get through the system, which was around, because basically drainage rates only apply to about roughly 2/3 of metropolitan Perth, because that's essentially where the metropolitan drainage system that Water Corp manage. If you applied that rate, which turns out to be give or take $50 a year, so about $1 a week, across the whole of the metropolitan area, and it was available for, you know, some of it for local governments, it would help significantly. But it's very, very difficult to get a policy process like that through, or a funding process through the policy environment, unless we've actually got, you know, the alignment of all the ducks. Those ducks in my 30-odd years have never lined up around getting that through. But it is a proposition that needs to be a debate that's ongoing in terms of how do we actually fund the ongoing maintenance and management of those systems. It's a legitimate proposition, I believe. Please.
I think further to that, there should be, I mean, when we look at just recently, we've got $1.2 billion has just become available for flights, which I understand is, but to certainly, yep, to Byrne, and but there is tourism, yep, Marimbula, I know mate's trying to get me to go and visit him, but there is more money in the system that is available for these things, and when we look at those multiple benefits, and the benefits across the health system, and the benefits across local government and state government, and offsetting future costs. Health budget. I've brought up numerous times seeing people and the joy they get from visiting a wetland, going, well, that might offset someone having a heart attack. I've seen people in distress at a wetland I used to manage who would go there, and then you could see them visibly just relax and be calm. So yeah, how much is that saving the health system? So how much more from that holistic point of view can we tap into more holistic budgets to facilitate some of these transformations we need?
And just before Stuart speaks, any propositions from the floor about what's not negotiable for 2030 as well in a moment? Please, Stuart. I'll just let Stuart respond and then over to you.
Sorry, I was just going to say a couple of quick things. I think probably now's a good time. With the iron ore $170 a tonne, I think WA is in pretty good shape. And I think from a development perspective or an industry perspective, I think levies or additional costs just need to be equitable in terms of how they're distributed and levied across the industry. If you're going to be bringing in new things, then if it's equitable, then the whole industry burdens that weight, and ultimately the market does.
Please.
I just wanted to clarify that you raised the issue about climate change and there being a lack of targets, essentially, and clear policy in that direction. So if you set clear policy and clear targets, and then out of that various agencies develop their policy and targets based on that climate change target, and then you incentivise local governments to be innovative, they are more supportive of unique development ideas, and then the funding sort of comes naturally, and you can actually fund it through all sorts of different programs, through those very high level targets at the climate change end. And the CRC have been very busily working on a great big box full of tools for us to use, so the tools are there.
Yeah, I guess to clarify, the target is currently net zero by 2050. And my hypothesis, and plenty of others and scientists that study this stuff, saying that's too late. So we have a target of 2050 and some things in place for 2050. It's too late. We need to drag that back to 2035 or even earlier.
So, I mean, like groundwater allocation. So if local governments had a date and an allocation now, then they would work towards that and they would be innovative. So that's just an example. But there could be a whole range of other targets that come out of a more realistic climate change.
Please, another question down here, or proposition even.
Yeah, hello. Stuart, thanks for joining us as in order to represent the entire development industry. We've been waiting for one all day, so so although there's probably a dozen questions that would be great to ask, but maybe just to focus on one. There was an earlier proposition that innovation sells, and if that was true, that would be a real good news for us. What do you reckon about that proposition?
Look, I'd love to say it does, but at the moment, at least, or in the last 5 years, it's come down to dollars and cents. Which is a bit sad, but unfortunately it's a bit of the harsh reality on the ground that for all of the great work that I think is done on the urban front at least, and I talk about new developments, sometimes I worry that it doesn't get valued, despite the fact that when you drive into a place and it makes you feel nice, like driving over the Neerija Brook into our project Springtime in Haynes, it makes you feel really nice. Maybe there's some underlying benefit there, but to be honest, we don't see it on the revenue side in our lot sales. That project is in the mix with all the others, and in an industry which is more and more led by dollars and cents, builders pushing product through the industry to clients. There's no recognition. They're looking at squares on a page, putting a house on it, pushing it out the door on a house and land finance package, and so that's the battle. Is trying to get that recognition.
What do you reckon it would take to get there? Any strategies?
Well, I think perhaps there's got to ultimately be some financial benefit, that can flow through to the customer. If these things can be cheaper, if they can be done more effectively, if we can use at-source infiltration instead of pit and pipe, and therefore saving costs on putting all this heavy drainage under the ground and bringing up fill levels as a result, then that's what we need to pursue. So it starts with saving money, essentially.
Any other questions from the floor? Please.
I'm going to add to this discussion, I suppose. Do you think our city is too sprawling and this land development supply on the periphery is actually the big issue? And we've got so much parkland that go relatively underutilised across the broader metro. Are we not pushing hard enough for infill? And it's that oversupply actually of the suburban model on the car-dependent periphery.
Is that a question to me? Gee, it's look, that's a really hard thing to answer from my point of view. I mean, I'm in the industry obviously, and my livelihood depends on it at the moment, at least. Look, it feels to me like we've never pushed harder in terms of density, in the areas, and I think that's a fantastic thing. I think there's a real recognition now of the importance of choice in the market, and being able to choose a 2x1 apartment as a young family in the city, or 3x4x2 house and land package, on the periphery. So I think as a result, that probably we're competing with that now. So we see buyers that go, no, I think I'll go a bit closer to town because I can. So I guess what that does is it probably slows the rate of urban expansion, as you refer to it. But I guess in any event, from an industry point of view, the plan is there. The land is zoned. You know, industry is investing. It's going to happen. It's about making sure it happens right and it happens well. You know, we're a city and we need to accommodate more and more people. They've got to go somewhere, and I think so long as we use that city in the best way we can, and don't push beyond into unsuitable areas, then I think we're heading in the right direction in terms of that policy.
Any other? I don't want to keep people away from their drinks. Just a couple more. We're at 10 minutes? 15. 15? Well, the energy in the room's starting to drain away and heading towards drinks in my humble view, but there's a few more questions.
Water Corporation could do some singing.
Where are your colleagues?
Just on the sprawl question, I always love going back to a great piece of work by a landscape architect, but Boomtown, that book, there was one page in that book that I referred to so often it became quite dog-eared, showing people, I'm like, look at the footprint of Perth, look at the sprawl footprint in comparison to Beijing, in comparison to a number of other cities in that density. I think Stuart's got some fantastic points, and it's from that point in Boomtown when there was very little infill happening. Yeah, and even today on the way in, looking across at a development sign on Stirling Highway with 300 lots and going, wow, that's what literally there was some pages in Boomtown that spoke to that along those major transport corridors, along that infill that we need, by then juxtaposing that with driving through the urban front on the weekend, coming back from Gingin and seeing those lot land packages out there and realising, yeah, they're just going, whoa, my commute is nothing compared to what some people have. So yeah, I certainly do think from a sustainability, health and environment perspective that sprawl really should be contained. But I guess it's how we do that well. And I know there's some great work that the CRC's done, and Jeffrey Bolton and Nigel Bertram, and that missing middle. How can we get that great infill into urban areas without just that squeezing 10 people into single dwellings on the one lot? Let's go up and have some great public open space around. And we're now seeing developers really starting to deliver that, which is fantastic, because we need that as proof of concept. So people go, oh, actually, yeah, I do want to live closer into the city, and I can have a great quality of life from being near all these transport corridors and other things. Still don't think the old idea of getting people to give up their cars is working yet. We need something in that space, and hopefully autonomous transport may fill a gap. I don't know, some people are saying it won't, but yeah, I think there's we're in a lot better space than we were when Boomtown was written. But in terms of where we go with sprawl, I think containing it is pretty important.
Thank you. Please.
Oh, I guess it was just reflecting on it, you know, it coming down to dollars and cents, and I suppose it's that education again, that it's not just the cost of buying the house, but the cost of living in the house, and that, you know, what's it going to cost you in terms of power bills and water bills, and, you know, the things that hit people's pocket over the whole life cycle. Yeah, and I mean, Department of Communities have been doing some great work with, you know, retrofitting their public housing stock, and that's providing, you know, financial benefit to the people that live there as well. So I suppose, yeah, that it's just raising people's awareness of all of those considerations, as well as, you know, the potential health costs to them and everything else.
I think that was a statement, not a question. No question. Panel members, any concluding statements? There was a few great throwaways in amongst, or catchphrases in what you talked about. Giles, you talked about the importance of mentors. Susan talked a lot about the importance of you know, that underlying groundwater quality, or being a quality and a special resource that we have in our context. Suzanne, you talked about it's all about all of you being actors in this leadership game, and Stuart, you talked about the really cultural sense of and the importance of water in our landscape and our environment. So I just throw it back to yourself. Final sentence or two from each of you, and then we'll enjoy the rest of the day.
my final comment is, I suppose, I was quite encouraged to hear some threads of a real sense of understanding where we live in today's conversation, like understanding we live on the Swan Coastal Plain, understanding that the western side of it's different to the eastern side of it. I think there's that dichotomy of not enough water and too much water that we have to work out, which is a bit the same as our dichotomy of quite long dry summers, mostly dry summers and shortish wet winters. So that's another dichotomy. But for me, the most significant thing about where we live is on the western side of a landmass at latitude 32. That means it's going to get drier and drier and drier, and we really have to work out how to adjust to that.
And that's going to take some work.
Yeah, couple of things I think is just thanks for the CRC and everyone who's been involved, and everybody in that water space that have created that enabling environment in WA, and that leadership doesn't necessarily have to be about your position in an organisation, your status and other things. It's about being active, and I certainly look to someone even like Emma for driving the Indigenous Water Knowledge Project. That's a voice that's been missing, and it's those voices that need to be heard more. But it's just that community of practice that we've created in this space that's just fantastic, and I think just want to keep growing.
Thank you. Two final thoughts. We have talked a lot today about potable and non-potable water for our consumptive use. I like to think about water as consumptive and non-consumptive, and by consumptive I mean the water that is in the landscape that we don't need to extract to put in our toilets or water our gardens with. It is there because it's valuable to the environment and to us in a social, cultural value. So the non-consumptive water, we can't forget that, and we mustn't lose that. And the value of that to us as a society, including to Indigenous people, can't be forgotten. There's been a recent ruling in New Zealand that the Waikato River has personhood status and all the legal rights that go with that. There is a push to have the Fitzroy River given that status as well, given that is one of the last unregulated rivers in Western Australia. I think that's a really exciting development for how we legislatively value the non-consumptive water for its intrinsic value. Secondly, around leadership, none of us do this alone. We all have people around us. We encourage and support people, and they encourage and support us as well. So we have to retain our sense of optimism and our sense of hope on this. And if we notice it flagging in ourselves, then we can pick it up from others, and the same in reverse. So keep each other buoyant and optimistic about this. It's the only way we're going to get anywhere.
Thank you. Stuart.
Thanks, Mike. I guess from Urban Quarter's point of view, if you don't mind, I just wanted to recognise Shelley and Helen from Abaqua. I mean, we're a small private land developer who has, I guess, been encouraged and to do good things in this space, be it the Nearigan Brook, which we've done out in springtime, a trial we did at Bletchley Park in Southern River where we utilised Ironman gypsum blended around subsoil drains to reduce the flush of nutrients into our downstream water sources, to just the use of biofiltration and tree pits and roadside swales in all of our projects, really, to encourage sort of that on-site infiltration and treatment. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of pay tribute to the girls and women. Sorry, thank you. They're girls. As leaders, so in this space, as great leaders in this space, and that's yeah, a real testament to both of you. So thank you from myself and Urban Quarter, and I'm sure many in the room. And I guess just finally, thanks for having me along today. I hope I've been able to sort of, I guess, provide some good sort of background and some good input. And I sort of really appreciate the opportunity, and I think we're heading in the right space, heading in the right direction. I really do, and certainly I also think that there's been some pretty ordinary urban development on the urban front. There's no question about that, very ordinary. And sometimes I drive around sort of shaking my head as to the island effect and lack of trees and all that sort of thing. And certainly we're on board to making it better. So, thank you.
Well done. And I understand, John, you're going to come up and say a few closing remarks. Are the panel allowed to retire to their seats, or they need to? You can go back. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.